Hey guys, tonight we step back nearly 2 centuries to a world where your smartphone would be a useless rectangle of glass, where the nearest hospital might be a 3-day ride through wolf-infested forest, and where the simple act of drinking water could kill you faster than any outlaw's bullet. You're about to discover the forgotten secrets of survival in 1800s America, the ingenious, sometimes bizarre and often desperate techniques that kept our ancestors alive in a land that seemed determined to destroy them at every turn. Picture yourself standing on the edge of wilderness so vast it swallows entire wagon trains, where the nearest neighbour lives 5 miles through unmarked terrain, and where tonight's dinner depends entirely on whether you remember which berries won't stop your heart. Let's be honest here, you probably wouldn't survive your first week. Most of us wouldn't. We've grown soft in our climate-controlled boxes with our same-day delivery and our antibiotics, and that's perfectly fine. But tonight we're going to appreciate just how remarkable those frontier folks truly were. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. It always amazes me how this little bedtime community stretches across every time zone, from someone in Tokyo watching with morning coffee to someone in London fighting to keep their eyes open just a little longer. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and for a moment you have absolutely no idea where you are. The ceiling above you isn't the smooth white drywall you're accustomed to. It's rough-hewn timber, gaps between the logs stuffed with a mixture of mud and dried grass that the locals call chinking. A spider has built an elaborate home in the corner, and honestly, you're going to leave her alone because she's earning her keep, eating the other insects that consider your cabin their personal residence. The year is 1847, and you've somehow found yourself inhabiting the body of a settler somewhere in the Ohio River Valley, about 200 miles from anything resembling civilization as you understand it. The first thing you notice is the cold. It seeps through the thin blanket, wool, scratchy, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something you'd rather not identify, and settles into your bones with a familiarity that suggests it never really left. Your breath forms small clouds in the grey morning light, filtering through oiled paper, stretched across what passes for a window. Glass windows exist, certainly, but they're luxuries reserved for folks with more money than you currently possess, which is to say, almost anyone. You need to get up. You know this intellectually, but your body stages a brief protest, because the floor is going to be freezing and the fire has died down to embers overnight, and everything about this situation feels profoundly unfair. But here's your first survival lesson of many. In the 1800s, lying in bed feeling sorry for yourself was a luxury that could genuinely get you killed. Every moment of daylight was precious, every calorie of energy needed to be spent wisely, and the frontier had absolutely no patience for procrastination. So you swing your legs over the side of the rope bed, yes, rope, woven in a crisscross pattern beneath a thin straw-stuffed mattress, which explains the phrase, sleep tight, that you've heard all your life without ever understanding, and your feet hit packed earth. Some cabins have wooden floors, but yours doesn't. The ground beneath you has been trampled so thoroughly over the years that it's nearly as hard as stone, and in summer it stays remarkably cool, but right now it's sending ice directly into your nervous system through the soles of your feet. The first order of business, before food, before water, before anything else, is that fire. You stumble toward the hearth, where last night's blaze has reduced itself to a sullen heap of ash and ember. This is where things get interesting, because the way you handle the next few minutes will determine whether you eat a hot breakfast or spend an hour of precious morning time trying to coax flame from friction. The wise settler, which you're rapidly learning to become, bank the fire carefully before bed. This isn't just piling ash over the coals, though, that's part of it. You positioned larger pieces of hardwood at the edges, arranged in a way that would burn slowly through the night, collapsing inward as they consumed themselves. You buried glowing embers under a thick layer of ash to insulate them from the cold air. And if you were particularly clever, you placed a flat stone near the fire's heart, because stone holds heat far longer than wood or ash, and that thermal mass kept the embers alive through the coldest hours. Now you kneel before the hearth, and this is almost a religious act really, the supplication before the source of life. You gently blow away the top layer of ash, and there, like buried treasure, you find them. glowing coals the colour of sunset, still holding enough heat to ignite fresh kindling. You've prepared this kindling the night before, because you're not an amateur, which means you're actually imagining yourself as someone who's been doing this for months and has learned from painful experience. The kindling sits in a small pile near the hearth, thin strips of dry bark, a bird's nest you found abandoned last autumn, and shavings you whittled from a pine log, their resinous surfaces ready to catch flame with minimal encouragement. You arrange the kindling over the coals in a loose tent shape. Airflow is crucial, you've learned, because fire breathes just like you do, and you lean close and blow. Gentle at first, then with more purpose, watching the coals shift from dull red to bright orange. A wisp of smoke rises from the bark shavings. You blow again, steady, controlled, and suddenly there's flame. Actual flame, licking upward and catching the bird's nest material, spreading to the pine shavings with a satisfying crackle. Historians still argue whether the flint and steel method or the bow drill was more commonly used by settlers, but the truth is, most experienced frontier folk avoided both whenever possible. Starting a fire from scratch was exhausting, time-consuming, and far from guaranteed. The real survival skill was never letting your fire die in the first place. Some families kept their hearth fires burning continuously for years, passing the flame from generation to generation like a sacred inheritance. When you move to a new homestead, you might carry coals in a special container, a pierced tin box filled with slow-burning punkwood, transporting that precious fire for miles rather than risk the uncertainty of starting fresh. As the flames grow, you add progressively larger pieces of wood, and the cabin begins its slow transformation from icebox to something approaching tolerable. The fire serves so many purposes that you almost can't list them all. Heat, obviously, but also cooking, light after sunset, protection from animals who fear the flame, a place to dry wet clothing, a source of coals for your warming pan on the coldest nights, and the psychological comfort of watching something alive and dancing when the darkness outside feels absolute. Here's a quirky detail that most modern people never consider. The type of wood you burn matters enormously, and experienced settlers could identify trees by the characteristics of their flame alone. Oak burns slow and hot, perfect for overnight banking. Pine catches quickly but spits sparks and burns fast, useful for starting fires, dangerous for keeping them. Hickory gives excellent coals for cooking. Applewood smells wonderful and burns clean. Greenwood, freshly cut, hisses and smokes and gives weak heat, so you need to season your firewood for months before use, which means the wood you're burning this winter was actually cut last spring. This kind of planning ahead was essential to survival, the long game that separated those who thrived from those who merely survived, and both groups from those who didn't make it at all. With the fire established, you stand and stretch, your joints popping in the cold air. The cabin around you comes into sharper focus as the growing flames throw dancing shadows across the walls. It's small, maybe 16 feet square, but it contains everything you need to survive. A rough table, 2 stools, a set of wooden shelves holding your few possessions. Strings of dried herbs hang from the rafters alongside strips of smoked meat. A rifle rests in wooden pegs above the door, its presence both tool and reassurance. You realise you're thirsty, desperately so, and this presents your next challenge. The water bucket sits near the door, and when you lift the wooden lid, you find exactly what you expected: a solid sheet of ice. This is inconvenient but not catastrophic. You chip away a chunk with your knife. That knife never leaves your belt, ever. It's the most important tool you own. And place the ice in a small pot near the fire to melt. In about 20 minutes you'll have drinkable water. The settlers called this their morning routine, though they rarely had a name for it. It was simply what you did, as automatic as breathing. While you wait for the ice to melt, you attend to other morning necessities. The chamber pot needs emptying. Yes, that's exactly what you think it is. And no, there's no indoor plumbing anywhere within 100 miles. And you carry it outside to the privy, which is a small wooden structure about 50 yards from the cabin. The walk is bracing, the air sharp enough to make your lungs ache, and the ground crunches beneath your feet with frozen dew. The privy itself is basic. A wooden seat over a deep hole, a pile of ash and lime nearby to sprinkle down after each use to reduce smell and discourage flies. In summer, this walk is pleasant. In winter, It's a test of willpower that makes you appreciate indoor bathrooms with a fervour that borders on spiritual. Back inside, the water has melted, and you drink deeply, feeling the cold liquid trace its path down your throat and into your empty stomach. Breakfast will come next, but first you need to consider what the day holds. The survival mindset of the 1800s wasn't reactive. It was relentlessly proactive. Every day began with a mental inventory. What needs doing? What could go wrong? What resources do I have? What resources do I need? You learn to think 3 moves ahead, like a chess player, because the frontier punished those who only responded to the immediate crisis. Today, you decide, requires several things. The wood pile is getting low, which means you'll spend part of the morning splitting logs. The snares you set 3 days ago need checking. Hopefully, there's a rabbit waiting for you, because fresh meat would be welcome. And that hole in the cabin's chinking, the one you've been ignoring near the west wall, needs patching before the next storm arrives. Each task is straightforward. Together, they represent a full day's labour, and you haven't even considered the unexpected problems that frontier life constantly throws at you. But that's the rhythm, isn't it? Wake, tend the fire, address immediate needs, work until the light fails, sleep, repeat. It sounds monotonous, and in some ways it was, but there's also a clarity to this kind of living that our modern minds rarely experience. No notifications, no meetings, no abstract anxieties about things happening in distant places. Just you, the land, and the eternal negotiation between human will and natural indifference. The fire crackles and pops, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. You add another log, watching the flames embrace it, and you feel the first real warmth of the day begin to seep into your muscles. Outside, the sun is fully up now, painting the frost-covered world in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere in the distance a crow calls, then another, their harsh voices carrying through the cold air like announcements. You're alive, you're warm. The day stretches ahead with its challenges and its simple rewards, and as you stand there in your rough cabin, watching the fire you coaxed from dying embers, you understand something that your ancestors knew in their bones. Survival isn't a single dramatic act. It's 1,000 small decisions, 1,000 tiny competencies, 1,000 moments of paying attention when it would be easier to be lazy. The frontier didn't care about your excuses or your good intentions. It only cared about what you actually did. And right now what you're going to do is make breakfast. The fire you've coaxed back to life isn't just a source of warmth. It's the beating heart of your entire existence out here. As you settle into the morning rhythm of your 1847 cabin, you begin to appreciate something that most modern humans have completely forgotten. The profound, almost mystical relationship between people and flame that sustained humanity for countless millennia before someone invented the thermostat. Your fire needs constant attention, like a demanding pet that will literally let you freeze to death if you neglect it. But unlike a cat or dog, this pet serves about 15 essential functions, and you're going to learn every single one of them whether you like it or not. The settlers who thrived on the frontier weren't just people who could start fires. They were fire artists, flame whisperers, masters of combustion, who understood heat and fuel with an intimacy that modern people reserve for their smartphones. Let's talk about banking, because this is the technique that separates the living from the hypothermic. When you bank a fire for the night, you're not just burying coals under ash, you're creating an environment where combustion slows to a barely perceptible crawl, while maintaining just enough heat to reignite come morning. The process starts about an hour before bed. You stop adding fresh fuel and let the fire burn down to a thick bed of glowing coals. Then you use a fire rake, basically a long metal pole with a flat end, to spread those coals into an even layer across the hearth floor. Here's where the artistry comes in. You take your largest, densest pieces of hardwood, oak is ideal, but hickory or maple work well too, and arrange them in a specific pattern. 2 logs go parallel to each other with a gap between them, sitting directly on the coal bed. A 3rd log goes across the top, creating a bridge. This structure allows airflow while burning extremely slowly, and as the logs consume themselves, they collapse inward onto the coals, feeding them through the night hours. Then comes the ash blanket. Using your rake, you carefully push ash from the hearth's edges over the entire arrangement, creating an insulating layer about 2 inches thick. The ash acts like a down comforter, trapping heat while limiting oxygen. The fire doesn't die, it hibernates, breathing just enough to stay alive. Skilled practitioners could bank a fire that would maintain viable coals for 18 hours or more, waking to find that precious glow still pulsing beneath the grey covering. The chemistry here is actually fascinating, even if the settlers didn't understand it in scientific terms. Wood combustion requires 3 things: fuel, heat, and oxygen. Remove any one, and the fire dies. But reduce oxygen gradually while maintaining heat, and you get a sort of suspended animation. The wood pyrolyzes slowly, releasing gases that don't fully combust, creating that familiar smoky smell while preserving the heat source for later. It's essentially the same principle behind charcoal production, though the fireplace version is far less efficient. Now, what happens if you fail? What if you wake to find nothing but cold ash and the memory of warmth? This is where backup systems become essential, because experienced frontier families always had multiple fire-starting methods ready. The most common was the flint and steel kit, carried in a small leather pouch called a tinderbox. The flint was a hard, sharp stone, usually actual flint or occasionally quartz, while the steel was a curved piece of carbon steel, often decorated and sometimes inherited across generations. To use this setup, you hold the steel in your dominant hand and strike it against the flint's sharp edge at an angle. The collision shears off tiny particles of steel, and the friction heats these particles hot enough to oxidize instantly. Basically, you're creating miniature sparks that are actually burning metal. These sparks fall onto your tinder, which must be incredibly dry and incredibly fine to catch such brief heat. Common tinder materials included charred cloth, cotton fabric that had been partially burned in a sealed container, creating a material that ignites from the slightest spark, or dried fungi like amadou, which grows on birch trees and was prized across the world for its fire-catching properties. The process is harder than it sounds. Modern people trying historical fire-starting methods often spend frustrated hours producing nothing but sore hands and mild profanity. The angle matters, the force matters, the quality of your materials matters, and even the humidity in the air matters. Settlers who had done this 1,000 times could produce flame in under a minute. Beginners might take 20 attempts or more. Historians still argue whether friction-based methods like the bow drill were common among European-American settlers, or remained primarily the domain of indigenous peoples, who had perfected these techniques over millennia. The evidence suggests most settlers who could afford steel relied on it heavily, while those in more desperate circumstances, or those who had learned from native neighbours, did employ friction methods as backups. The bow drill, for those unfamiliar, is almost elegantly simple in concept and devilishly difficult in execution. You need a fireboard, a flat piece of dry, soft wood, with a notch cut into it. A spindle, usually made from the same wood as the fireboard, sits upright in a small depression. A bow, string-wrapped once around the spindle, provides the motion, and a socket held in your non-bow hand keeps downward pressure on the spindle while allowing it to spin freely. When you saw the bow back and forth, the spindle rotates rapidly against the fireboard, generating friction heat. The notch allows the accumulating wood dust to collect in one spot, and eventually, if your technique is good, your materials are perfect, and the universe is feeling generous, that dust reaches ignition temperature and forms a tiny glowing coal called an ember. You then carefully transfer this ember to a tinder bundle, blow gently to introduce oxygen, and pray. On a good day, with well-prepared materials and practiced technique, you might achieve fire in 5 minutes. On a bad day, cold, damp, exhausted, using suboptimal wood, you might never achieve it at all. This is why sensible people preferred the flint and steel, and why everyone preferred simply never letting their fire die in the first place. There's a quirky historical detail worth mentioning here. Some frontier families maintained what they called a fire horn. This was typically a cow horn or hollowed gourd filled with slow-burning punkwood, usually from rotting willow or poplar that had dried to a soft, fibrous consistency. The punk would smoulder for hours without flaming, providing a portable ember source that could be blown into flame when needed. If you were travelling between homesteads or working in distant fields, you might carry this fire horn with you, maintaining that precious ember rather than risking the uncertainty of starting fresh. The social aspects of firekeeping also developed into unwritten frontier rules. If your fire died and you couldn't restart it, you didn't suffer in silence. You walked to your nearest neighbour, even if that neighbour lived miles away, and asked for coals. This request was never refused. Denying someone fire was considered almost as serious as denying them water or food. It simply wasn't done. Some families kept a special container specifically for sharing fire, a small covered pot that could transport coals safely. And here's something that might surprise you. Fire theft was a real concern. Not that anyone would sneak into your cabin and steal your flames, but rather that careless visitors might let your fire die through inattention, or that departing guests might accidentally carry away your carefully prepared tinder. Some frontier hosts kept their tinder boxes hidden when strangers visited, a small precaution that reflected the life or death importance of fire-starting materials. The types of fires you built varied dramatically based on purpose. A cooking fire needed to be different from a heating fire, which was different from a fire meant primarily for light. For cooking, you wanted coals rather than flame. Steady, even heat that could be controlled. You'd let a wood fire burn down completely, rake the coals into a flat bed, and cook over these using iron pots suspended on hooks or trivets. The phrase, cooking over an open fire, is somewhat misleading. Competent frontier cooks rarely cooked over open flame, which burns food and deposits soot. They cooked over controlled coal beds, adjusting heat by raising or lowering their cookware or by moving coals around. For heating, you wanted a larger, longer-burning fire that radiated warmth throughout the cabin. The fireplace design itself was crucial. A wide, shallow firebox reflected heat into the room, while the throat of the chimney needed to be sized correctly to draw smoke without pulling too much warm air outside. The Rumford fireplace, invented in the late 1700s, represented a significant improvement in efficiency, with its angled sides and tall, narrow opening. But many frontier cabins made do with cruder designs, losing enormous amounts of heat up poorly designed chimneys. Some families built two separate fire structures, a main fireplace for heating and a detached kitchen building for cooking. This kept the summer cooking heat away from the main living space and reduced fire risk to the primary dwelling. If your kitchen burned down, a common occurrence, you lost food and equipment but not your family's home. This kind of risk management was woven throughout frontier life, the constant calculation of what could go wrong and how to minimize the damage. The fuel you selected shaped your entire fire experience. We've touched on this already, but it deserves emphasis because wood selection was genuinely a survival skill. Softwoods like pine and fir were easy to split and caught fire quickly, making them excellent kindling. But they burned fast, hot and dirty, leaving creosote deposits in your chimney that could ignite into a chimney fire. A terrifying event that could destroy your home in minutes. Hardwoods like oak, hickory and maple burned slower and cleaner, but required more effort to split and longer drying time. The ideal approach used both, softwood kindling to start your fire quickly, transitioning to hardwood for sustained burning. Fruitwoods like apple and cherry were prized for cooking because they burned hot and clean while imparting pleasant flavours to food. Elm was terrible for burning. It smouldered, smoked, and generally refused to behave. Cottonwood was only slightly better. Experienced settlers learned their local trees intimately, understanding not just which species burned well, but which individual trees in their woodlot provided the best fuel. And the labour involved in keeping yourself supplied with firewood was staggering. A single frontier family might burn 10 to 20 cords of wood per year, a cord being a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Each cord required felling trees, cutting them into manageable lengths, splitting those lengths into fireplace-sized pieces, hauling everything back to your cabin, and stacking it to dry. This work consumed hundreds of hours annually, much of it during the pleasant months when you'd rather be doing almost anything else. You learn to think about firewood the way modern people think about money, as a resource to be carefully managed, invested wisely and never wasted. Every stick that went into your fireplace represented past labour, and every fire you built was a spending decision. Burn too fast, too wastefully, and you'd run short come February. Burn too cautiously, and you'd freeze in December trying to stretch your supply. The fire crackles before you now, fully established, throwing warmth across your little cabin. You've added enough wood to last through breakfast preparations, and the cast iron skillet is warming on its hook, ready to receive whatever food you can muster this morning. The relationship between you and this fire is ancient, primal, stretching back to those first proto-humans who discovered that flame could transform their world. Every survival skill builds on this one. Without fire, nothing else works. The ice in your water bucket is fully melted now, and you've drunk your fill, but that simple act of hydration conceals a deadly complexity that killed thousands of pioneers who never understood what was happening to them. Water, that most essential of substances, was simultaneously life-giver and silent executioner throughout the 1800s, and the methods people developed to find it, collect it, transport it, and purify it represent some of the most ingenious and sometimes revolting survival techniques of the era. Your cabin sits about a quarter-mile from a small stream that winds through the valley, and every drop of water you use must be hauled from there in wooden buckets. This alone is significant labour. Water weighs about 8 pounds per gallon, and you need at least 3 gallons daily for drinking, cooking, and minimal cleaning. That's 24 pounds of water carried a quarter mile every single day, often through snow or mud or the pre-dawn darkness when you can barely see your feet. Some families dug wells, but well digging was backbreaking work that might yield nothing but dry hole, and even successful wells could go bad if the water table shifted or contamination seeped in. But here's the real problem, the one that wouldn't be properly understood until decades after your current situation, that stream water, crystal clear and delicious tasting, might be carrying death in every swallow. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, these waterborne diseases killed far more settlers than any wild animal or native conflict. Yet the connection between contaminated water and disease remained murky throughout most of the 1800s. The germ theory of disease wasn't widely accepted until the 1880s, which meant that for most of frontier history, people had no idea why they kept getting sick. They did notice patterns, though. Practical wisdom accumulated even without scientific understanding. Settlers observed that water from fast-flowing streams seemed safer than water from stagnant ponds. They noticed that water collected from springs bubbling up from underground rarely caused illness, while water drawn downstream from towns or settlements often did. They learned, through terrible experience, to avoid water sources near burial grounds, privies, or areas where animals congregated. The solutions they developed were sometimes brilliant, sometimes strange, and sometimes actively harmful. Boiling water was understood to make it safer, though nobody knew exactly why. The process wasn't called sterilization. It was simply what sensible people did when they suspected their water source might be bad. The problem was fuel. Boiling water required fire, fire required wood, and wood required labour. Many families skipped the boiling step when they were tired, or the weather was pleasant and the water looked fine. Many families buried their children. Filtering water through cloth or sand was another common practice. You'd pour stream water through layers of progressively finer fabric, watching the visible sediment accumulate while the clearer liquid passed through. This removed particles and improved taste, but did absolutely nothing against the microscopic pathogens actually causing disease. People thought they were purifying their water when they were really just making it prettier. Here's a quirky historical detail that illustrates the confusion of the era. Many settlers believed that adding whiskey to water made it safe to drink. There's a grain of truth here. Alcohol is indeed antimicrobial, but the concentrations needed to actually kill pathogens would render the water undrinkable and the drinker unconscious. What whiskey actually did was mask the taste of bad water and provide a pleasant buzz that made people less concerned about their intestinal future. Some families kept a whiskey barrel specifically for water treatment, adding a splash to each cup drawn from questionable sources. More effective, though still not scientifically understood, was the practice of letting water sit in copper or brass containers. These metals have natural antimicrobial properties, a fact that wouldn't be fully documented until the 20th century, and water stored in copper vessels genuinely did have lower bacterial counts. Some frontier families inherited copper water pitchers from European ancestors and considered them family treasures, never knowing that these vessels were actually providing practical disease prevention. The location and construction of wells demonstrated accumulated wisdom even without germ theory. Experienced settlers knew to dig wells uphill from any privy or livestock area, though they attributed this to smell rather than contamination flow. They knew to line wells with stone or brick to prevent collapse and limit groundwater infiltration from the surface. They knew to cover wells to prevent debris, insects, and animals from falling in. All of these practices reduced disease transmission, even though the practitioners couldn't explain why. Historians still argue whether Native American water purification methods were widely adopted by settlers or largely ignored. Evidence suggests significant knowledge transfer in some regions, particularly regarding which springs and streams were safe and which were traditionally avoided. Indigenous peoples had lived with these water sources for generations and accumulated practical wisdom that newcomers would have been foolish to disregard, though many newcomers were indeed exactly that foolish. Rainwater collection offered an alternative to stream or well water, and some frontier families built elaborate systems to capture and store rainfall. A simple approach involved placing barrels beneath the roof strip line, catching water as it ran off wooden shingles. More sophisticated setups channeled rainwater through covered gutters into sealed cisterns, minimising contamination from bird droppings and wind-blown debris. Rainwater was generally safer than surface water, though it still required filtering to remove the inevitable particles of roof material, insect parts, and miscellaneous organic matter. Winter presented both challenges and advantages for water supply. The challenge was obvious. Everything froze. Your stream might develop ice several inches thick, requiring you to chop through to the flowing water beneath. Your carried water froze in its bucket before you got it home. Any stored water in your cabin froze solid overnight, unless kept near the fire. The advantage was more subtle. Frozen water, when melted, was often safer than liquid water, because the freezing process killed some pathogens and concentrated contaminants in ways that made them easier to avoid. Snow, specifically, became a valuable water source during winter months. Clean, fresh snow, collected from areas away from paths, animal trails and privies, could be melted to produce reasonably pure water with minimal effort. The key word was fresh. Snow that had been on the ground for days accumulated contaminants from dust, animal waste, and whatever else the wind carried. First hour snow from a clean snowfall was best, gathered into buckets and brought inside to melt slowly near the fire. There's something almost meditative about melting snow for water, and you find yourself watching the process as your morning continues. The white crystals gradually darken, compress, and transform into liquid, the volume shrinking dramatically as trapped air escapes. A bucket packed full of fluffy snow yields may be a quarter bucket of water, which is why serious snow melting required significant quantities of raw material. Still, it beat chopping through creek ice in sub-zero temperatures. Your personal water consumption was only part of the equation. Livestock needed water too, far more than humans actually. A single horse might drink 10 gallons daily, a cow somewhat less. If you had animals, you either located your homestead very near a water source or faced the exhausting prospect of hauling hundreds of pounds of water daily. Some settlers built elaborate systems involving wooden troughs, gravity-fed pipes, and even primitive windmills to reduce this labour. Others simply accepted that animal care would consume hours of every day. The social dynamics of water access shaped entire communities. When a family dug a successful well, they became important. Neighbours without wells depended on their goodwill, and that dependency created obligations and relationships that bound the community together. Water rights, even in informal frontier settings, generated disputes that sometimes turned violent. If your upstream neighbour decided to dam the creek for his own mill, suddenly your downstream access was compromised. If your neighbour's privy leached into your well, you had a grievance that might simmer for generations. And here's a detail that might disturb modern sensibilities. Human waste was sometimes deliberately added to water sources, not as contamination, but as fertilizer. Farmers knew that night soil, the polite term for collected human feces, enriched crop fields when applied correctly. Some applied it a bit too liberally, a bit too near streams, creating disease chains that could devastate entire settlements. The concept of watershed protection, of maintaining buffer zones between waste and water, developed slowly through painful experience. Personal hygiene also intersected with water scarcity in ways that modern people might find difficult to accept. Full baths were rare, weekly at best for most frontier families, and monthly or seasonal for some. The labour of hauling, heating and disposing of bathwater simply couldn't be justified more frequently. Instead, people washed faces and hands daily, if diligent, spot-cleaned as needed, and accepted a baseline level of dirt and odour that would horrify contemporary noses. Laundry was even more water-intensive and therefore even rarer. Wash day might come once every 2 weeks or once a month, and involved heating massive quantities of water, scrubbing clothes on ribbed boards with harsh lye soap, rinsing multiple times, and wringing each item by hand. The entire process consumed an entire day and left everyone involved exhausted. Clothing was designed accordingly, layers that could be removed when soiled, undergarments that bore the brunt of body contact, outer garments that might go months between washings. The drinking water in your cup right now, melted from last night's ice, is probably fine. You collected it from a fast-flowing section of the stream, upstream from the nearest settlement, and you've noticed no off-taste or unusual colour. But you're also aware, in a way that your ancestors couldn't be, that safety is uncertain, that the clear liquid before you might contain invisible threats. This knowledge makes you cautious, makes you boil water when you're not sure, makes you collect snow when it's fresh and rainwater when it's clean. The fire crackles, the water cools to drinkable temperature, and somewhere in the distance you hear the stream that sustains you. Its constant murmur a reminder that survival here depends on flows and sources you can barely control. You drink, you fill your belly, and you prepare for whatever the day demands. Your stomach is rumbling now, reminding you that water alone won't sustain the labour this day requires. Breakfast needs to happen, but in 1847, breakfast isn't a matter of opening the refrigerator. It's a calculation involving what you gathered last summer, what you preserved last autumn, and what the forest floor might still offer in this brittle winter season. The wild pantry of frontier America was vast and generous to those who knew how to read it, but it was equally lethal to those who guessed wrong. The knowledge of foraging passed through communities like a precious inheritance, mother to daughter, father to son, neighbour to neighbour. No formal textbooks existed for most settlers, just accumulated wisdom, rhyming mnemonics, and the ever-present cautionary tales of folks who ate the wrong thing and suffered for it. You learned which plants healed and which killed, which mushrooms nourished and which destroyed your liver, which berries sustained and which stopped your heart. This learning often came through error, and the errors were sometimes fatal. Your cabin contains several products of last year's foraging efforts, now dried and stored for winter use. Strings of wild onions hang from the rafters, their pungent smell mingling with wood smoke. A covered basket holds dried berries, blackberries and raspberries mostly, gathered in summer's abundance and spread on wooden frames to desiccate in the sun. A small pouch contains dried mint leaves for tea, and another holds crumbled sage useful for both cooking and medicine. This is your pantry, supplemented by whatever hunting, trapping and trading provides. Let's talk about the plants themselves, because understanding the forest's offerings was genuine survival knowledge. Spring brought the first edible greens after months of dried and preserved monotony. Ramps, wild leeks with their garlicky bite, pushed through still cold soil as early as March. Dandelion greens, which most modern people consider weeds, were treasured as vitamin-rich vegetables after winter's deprivation. Fiddlehead ferns, the curled emerging fronds of ostrich ferns, were gathered carefully and cooked immediately, providing a delicacy that some compared to asparagus. Summer exploded with possibility. Berry season started in June and continued through September, different species ripening in sequence. Strawberries first, then raspberries, blackberries, elderberries, and finally the late-season grapes. A diligent gatherer could spend significant portions of each summer day collecting these fruits, eating some fresh and preserving the rest. Wild plums and crabapples provided variety, though they required sweetening to be palatable, assuming you had any sugar or honey, which many families didn't. The nut harvest in autumn was crucial. Walnuts, hickory nuts, chestnuts and acorns provided calories and protein that could sustain you through winter months. Gathering these required competing with squirrels who had the same idea and considerable head starts. Processing nuts was labour-intensive, hulling, drying, cracking shells, picking out meats. Acorns presented a particular challenge because they contain tannins that taste bitter and can cause digestive upset. But Native American processing methods, which involved leaching the nuts in running water for extended periods, made acorns not just edible, but genuinely nutritious. Historians still argue whether acorn processing was widely adopted by European American settlers or remained primarily an indigenous practice. Evidence suggests regional variation. In areas where settlers had close contact with native communities, knowledge transfer occurred. In areas of conflict or separation, settlers often ignored acorns entirely or learned their uses only slowly through independent experimentation. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Cattails, those common swamp plants, with their distinctive brown seed heads, were among the most useful wild foods available. Every part of the plant was edible at some point in its life cycle. Young shoots in spring could be eaten like asparagus, Immature seed heads could be boiled like corn, the pollen could be collected and used as flour, the root, rich in starch, could be processed into flour as well. One expert has called the cattail the supermarket of the swamp, and frontier families who lived near wetlands knew this well. The danger side of foraging can't be overlooked, because the forest contained plants that looked edible, but were profoundly not. Water hemlock, sometimes called the most poisonous plant in North America, resembled wild carrot or parsnip closely enough to fool the inattentive. A single bite could trigger violent seizures and death within hours. Pokeweed, whose young shoots were sometimes eaten after careful preparation, became increasingly toxic as it matured. The berries and roots could kill. Nightshade, false hellebore, baneberry. The list of lethal lookalikes was long and unforgiving. Communities developed strategies to minimize foraging deaths. Never eat anything you haven't positively identified through multiple characteristics: leaf shape, stem color, flower pattern, root appearance, smell, habitat. When in doubt, don't. If trying something new, eat only a tiny amount and wait 24 hours before consuming more. Watch what animals eat, but remember that many animals can safely consume plants that would kill humans. Children were kept close during foraging expeditions and taught the dangerous plants as early as they could understand. Mushrooms represented a special category of risk and reward. Some species, morels, chanterelles, puffballs, chicken of the woods, were delicious and safe when properly identified. Others, deathcaps, destroying angels, gallerina, could kill you in agony over the course of several days, destroying your liver and kidneys before you fully understood what was happening. The margin for error was essentially zero, and many frontier families simply avoided wild mushrooms entirely, considering the risk too great for the reward. Those who did gather mushrooms developed almost mystical relationships with their quarry. They knew the trees certain species preferred, the weather conditions that triggered fruiting, the subtle differences between safe and deadly varieties. This knowledge came from long observation, careful teaching, and sometimes from losses that shaped a family's foraging practices for generations. Don't eat mushrooms was a common piece of advice precisely because the consequences of getting it wrong were so severe. Your breakfast this morning incorporates several foraged elements. You've pulled some dried onions from the rafter strings, rehydrating them in a small amount of warm water. A handful of dried berries adds sweetness to the cornmeal mush you're preparing, corn being one of the few grains that grows well in frontier conditions and stores reliably through winter. The combination isn't exciting by modern standards, but it provides calories, some vitamins, and the psychological comfort of a hot meal on a cold morning. The medicinal uses of plants overlapped significantly with their food uses, and skilled foragers maintained what amounted to wilderness pharmacies. Willow bark contained the compound we now call aspirin, and was chewed or brewed into tea for pain and fever. Elderflower was believed to ease colds and respiratory congestion. Yarrow could slow bleeding when applied to wounds. Plantain, the common weed, not the banana relative, drew out infections and soothed insect bites. These remedies weren't superstition. Many had genuine pharmacological activity that modern science has confirmed. But they were also mixed with treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful, and distinguishing good medicine from bad medicine was often impossible without the controlled studies that wouldn't exist for another century. You used what you had, observed what seemed to work, and hoped for the best. The seasonal rhythm of foraging shaped the entire year's activities. Spring was for greens and early shoots, supplemented by fishing as streams warmed and fish became active. Summer was for berries, garden vegetables if you had a garden, and the beginning of preservation activities. Autumn brought the nut harvest, the major preservation push, and final gathering before frost. Winter was for consumption rather than collection, living on what you'd stored and supplementing with whatever hunting provided. This rhythm also shaped your movements across the landscape. You knew where the best berry patches grew. That south-facing slope produced earlier, while the shaded hollow produced later and larger fruit. You knew where the nut trees clustered, that grove of hickories by the creek, the stand of oaks on the ridge. You knew where dangerous plants grew and steered children away from those areas. The land wasn't just wilderness. It was a known place, mapped in your mind through seasonal use patterns accumulated over years. The relationship between foraging and farming was more fluid than modern categories suggest. Many frontier families combined both, planting corn and beans and squash in cleared patches while continuing to gather wild foods from surrounding forests. The garden provided staples, the forest provided variety and insurance. If crops failed, and they did, regularly, due to drought or pests or early frost, wild foods might mean the difference between hardship and starvation. Your mush is ready now, steaming in its iron pot, the dried onions and berries lending some interest to what is otherwise fairly bland sustenance. You eat slowly, savouring the warmth, knowing that this fuel will power whatever work the day demands. Outside, the sun is higher, the frost beginning to glitter as it starts its slow transformation from crystal to dew. The forest that surrounds your little clearing isn't just scenery, it's a larder, a pharmacy, and a teacher, offering gifts to those patient enough to learn its lessons. Breakfast has fortified you, but the meal you just consumed represents only half the food equation that dominated frontier life. Gathering food was essential, preserving it was equally so. Without refrigeration, without the canning technology that wouldn't become widely available until later in the century, keeping meat and vegetables edible through brutal winters required skills that your great-great-grandparents knew intimately but that have since vanished from common knowledge. The preserving season began in autumn and continued with frantic intensity until the first hard freeze. Everything you gathered, slaughtered or harvested during these weeks needed to be rendered stable before winter sealed you into your cabin with whatever you'd managed to prepare. Success meant eating reasonably well until spring. Failure meant hunger, illness or death. Let's start with meat, because protein preservation presented the most significant challenges. Fresh meat spoils rapidly, within days in warm weather, slightly longer in cold, and the bacterial growth that causes spoilage also produces toxins that can sicken or kill. Your ancestors had no concept of bacteria, but they understood perfectly well that meat left too long turned slimy, smelly, and dangerous. The solutions they developed were elegant in their simplicity and brutal in their labour requirements. Salt was the primary preservation agent, and its importance to frontier communities cannot be overstated. Wars were fought over salt supplies. Entire economies revolved around salt production and distribution. A family without adequate salt faced not just bland food but genuine preservation crisis. The salt trade routes that crisscrossed early America represented survival infrastructure as critical as any road or river. Salt preservation worked through osmosis. When you packed meat in salt, water was drawn out of the flesh, creating an environment too dry and too saline for bacterial growth. The process was straightforward but time-consuming. You'd butcher your animal, a pig typically, or a deer if hunting had been good, and immediately begin working the meat. Each piece was rubbed thoroughly with salt, then packed into barrels or crocks with salt layered between pieces. The salt drew out moisture, creating brine that further preserved the meat. The result after several weeks of curing was salt pork or salt beef, meat that could last months or even years if kept cool and dry. The taste was intensely salty, of course, and needed to be soaked in fresh water before cooking to become palatable. But it was safe to eat, it provided essential protein and fat, and it could sustain a family through months when fresh meat was unavailable. Smoking provided another preservation method, often used in combination with salting. The smoke from burning hardwood contains compounds, phenols, aldehydes, various organic acids that inhibit bacterial growth and add flavour. After initial salting, meat was hung in a smokehouse, a small enclosed structure where wood fires smouldered for days or weeks. The combination of dehydration, salt and smoke created products like ham, bacon, and various sausages that could last through winter with minimal additional care. Building a proper smokehouse was an art form. The structure needed to contain smoke while allowing airflow. The fire needed to smoulder without flaming. Flames produced too much heat and not enough smoke. Temperature control was crucial. Too hot, and the meat cooked rather than preserved. Too cold, and bacterial growth continued. Hardwoods like hickory, apple, and oak were preferred for their flavour contributions. Softwoods were avoided because their resinous smoke produced bitter tastes and potentially harmful compounds. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates the sophistication of frontier food knowledge. Different smoking techniques produced different products with different storage characteristics. Cold smoking, done at temperatures below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, could continue for weeks and created products that might last years. Hot smoking, above 120 degrees, cooked the meat while preserving it, creating products meant for more immediate consumption. Experienced practitioners knew exactly what they were making and adjusted their techniques accordingly. Historians still argue whether certain preserved meat products, like pemmican, the concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, were primarily indigenous innovations or developed independently by European settlers. The evidence strongly suggests indigenous origins, with knowledge transfer occurring through trade, intermarriage, and simple observation. Pemmican was particularly valuable for travellers because of its incredible caloric density and stability, and fur traders relied on it heavily for extended journeys. Vegetables required different preservation approaches. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, potatoes, beets, could be stored without processing if kept properly cold and dark. The root cellar, dug into the ground beneath or adjacent to the cabin, provided these conditions. The Earth's temperature several feet below surface remains relatively constant year-round, cold enough to slow spoilage but warm enough to prevent freezing. A well-constructed root cellar might keep vegetables edible from autumn harvest through spring planting. The root cellar also stored other items requiring cool, stable conditions: crocks of preserved eggs, barrels of cider, kegs of sauerkraut. Eggs could be preserved remarkably well by coating them in various substances that sealed their pores against air: lard, mineral oil, water glass, sodium silicate solution. Properly treated eggs might remain edible for 6 months or more, providing winter breakfast options when the hens stopped laying. Sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables represented yet another preservation technology. When vegetables are submerged in brine, anaerobic bacteria begin converting sugars to lactic acid. This acid creates an environment hostile to spoilage organisms while producing distinctive tangy flavours. Sauerkraut, kimchi-like preparations, fermented pickles. These products could last indefinitely as long as they remained submerged and the fermentation proceeded correctly. The fermentation process wasn't entirely predictable. Sometimes batches went bad, developing off flavours or visible mould that indicated failure. Temperature mattered, too warm, and the fermentation proceeded too rapidly, producing mushy textures and excessive sourness. Too cold, and fermentation stalled entirely. Experienced practitioners developed intuitive understanding of how their specific conditions affected outcomes, adjusting salt levels and storage locations accordingly. Drying was perhaps the simplest preservation method, requiring no special equipment beyond time and suitable weather. Fruits and vegetables spread on wooden frames in direct sunlight lost moisture gradually, becoming concentrated and stable. Beans, peas and corn could be dried on the stalk before harvest, or spread to finish drying afterward. Dried produce stored in cloth bags or wooden boxes, protected from moisture and pests, could last years without degradation. Meat could also be dried, producing jerky and similar products. The technique worked best with lean cuts. Fat doesn't dry well and can go rancid even when meat is preserved. Strips were cut thin, sometimes rubbed with salt or spices, and hung in warm, dry conditions until completely desiccated. Properly made jerky was lightweight, calorie-dense, and nearly imperishable, making it ideal for travel or emergency supplies. The smoke coming from your fireplace right now carries some of these preservation compounds, though you're not actively smoking meat at the moment. Above your head, those strips of dried venison hanging from the rafters represent last autumn's hunting success, preserved through a combination of smoking and drying that rendered them stable for months. You'll probably incorporate some into today's dinner, rehydrating them in a stew that also includes root vegetables from your cellar. The psychological relationship between frontier families and their preserved food supplies deserves mention. That cellar full of vegetables, that smokehouse full of meat, that attic full of dried beans. These weren't just food, they were security, tangible reassurance against winter's threats. Families who entered winter with full supplies faced the cold months with confidence. Families who entered with inadequate stores faced constant anxiety, the gnawing awareness that hungry weeks likely lay ahead. This anxiety shaped behaviour in ways that might seem obsessive to modern observers. Nothing was wasted. Bones became soup stock, then dog food, then fertiliser. Vegetable scraps went to pigs or chickens. Even food that had partially spoiled was often salvaged, the bad portions cut away, the remainder consumed rather than discarded. The casual food waste that characterises contemporary life would have seemed almost criminal to people who understood viscerally what hunger felt like. Your storage areas are adequately supplied for this winter, not abundant but sufficient. The salt pork barrel is about half full, the root cellar reasonably stocked, the dried goods hanging where you can assess them at a glance. You've done the work, made the calculations, planned ahead in the ways that frontier life demanded. Now you eat day by day, watching supplies diminish, waiting for spring to renew the cycle once again. The cabin you're sitting in didn't exist 2 years ago. Before that, this was forest. Trees as thick as your leg, undergrowth tangled and impenetrable, the kind of wilderness that had never known an axe. You built this structure yourself, log by log, notch by notch, creating shelter from raw materials that the land provided. The process nearly killed you, and you understand now why building shelter from nothing was considered one of the fundamental frontier survival skills. Let's start with tree selection, because not all wood is created equal when it comes to cabin construction. You wanted straight trunks, minimal taper, few branches, trees that would stack cleanly with minimal gaps. Oak was too heavy and too hard to work, though settlers used it when nothing else was available. Pine was light and workable, but rotted faster and offered less insulation. The sweet spot was often poplar or tulip tree. Reasonably light, reasonably straight, reasonably rot-resistant, and abundant throughout the eastern forests. The felling itself was exhausting labour even with sharp tools, and keeping tools sharp was its own ongoing challenge. A good axe made everything easier. A dull axe turned every tree into an hours-long battle. You learned to read grain direction, to position your cuts for efficient removal, to judge which way a tree would fall and position yourself safely. People died felling trees, crushed by unexpected falls, struck by branches, injured by their own tools when exhaustion made hands clumsy. Once a tree was down, you limbed it, removing branches with axe and hatchet, then measured and cut to length. Your cabin required logs of consistent length, probably 16 feet, which would create a roughly 14-foot interior once the corner notches were cut. Each log needed to be roughly similar in diameter, which meant matching trees of similar age and growth rate. You probably felled 50 or 60 trees for a single-room cabin, selecting the best sections and leaving the rest for firewood or future projects. Transporting logs from forest to building site presented its own challenges. A single 16-foot log might weigh several hundred pounds, far too heavy for one person to carry. Various solutions existed: rolling logs using wooden poles as levers, dragging them with ropes or chains, using horses or oxen if you were fortunate enough to own draft animals. Some settlers built their cabins close to suitable timber, minimizing transport distance. Others had no choice but to haul logs considerable distances across uneven terrain. The corner notches were crucial to cabin construction, determining how tightly logs stacked and how stable the structure would be. Several notching styles existed, each with advantages and disadvantages. The saddle notch, a simple curved cutout, was fastest to execute but left gaps that required filling. The dovetail notch with its interlocking angles was more complex but created tighter, more stable corners. The square notch offered a compromise. You probably used whatever technique you'd been taught or had seen demonstrated, developing your own refinements through trial and error. Stacking logs required muscle and coordination, especially as walls grew higher. The first few courses were manageable, lifted into place by 1 or 2 strong workers. But by the 5th or 6th course, you needed assistance, neighbours helping neighbours in the community cooperation that made frontier settlement possible. Cabin raisings were social events as much as construction projects, bringing scattered families together for shared labour, shared food, and shared celebration when the walls reached roofline. Historians still argue whether the log cabin was a uniquely American innovation or a Scandinavian import brought by Swedish and Finnish settlers to the Delaware Valley. Evidence strongly suggests the latter. Horizontal log construction had been common in northern Europe for centuries before appearing in America, but the technique spread so rapidly among settlers of all backgrounds that it became effectively American regardless of its origins. The roof presented different challenges than the walls. Some cabins used log rafters supporting a layer of smaller poles, covered with bark shingles or wooden boards. Others used a simpler approach, a ridgepole running the cabin's length, with poles slanting down to the walls covered with layers of bark, thatch, or split boards. Roofing needed to shed water effectively while lasting multiple seasons without replacement. Leaky roofs were common, forcing inhabitants to position beds and supplies carefully around drip points. That chinking between your logs, the mixture of mud, clay, and dried grass stuffed into every gap, represents hours of additional labour after the main structure was complete. Unchunked logs left gaps that admitted wind, rain, snow, insects, and occasionally small animals. The chinking needed to be applied carefully, worked into crevices, and allowed to dry before the first frost. It also needed periodic maintenance, as settling and weather gradually created new gaps in previously sealed areas. Your floor is packed earth, which places your cabin in the simpler category of frontier construction. Wooden floors required additional lumber, additional labour, and raised the living surface above ground moisture while creating space below for cold air to accumulate. Some families compromised with puncheon floors, split logs laid flat side up, creating a rough but serviceable surface. Others simply accepted dirt floors, sometimes treating them with blood or clay to create a harder, more moisture-resistant surface. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Some frontier cabins had no windows at all, or windows so small they admitted almost no light. Glass was expensive, fragile, and difficult to transport. Oiled paper stretched over openings provided limited translucency. Wooden shutters could be opened in good weather, but meant darkness when closed against storms. Many settlers simply lived with dim interiors, conducting fine work outdoors and accepting that winter days would be spent largely in firelight. The sod house, or soddy, represented an alternative approach to shelter in treeless regions. On the Great Plains, where timber was scarce and expensive, settlers cut blocks of prairie sod, grass roots and the dense soil they bound together, and stacked these blocks like bricks to create walls. The resulting structures were surprisingly durable and well insulated, cool in summer and warm in winter. They were also perpetually dirty, prone to leaking, and home to various creatures that lived in the sod itself. Dugouts offered another treeless region option. Excavate a hillside, create a front wall from whatever materials were available, and roof the resulting cave with poles and sod. These were faster to construct than full sod houses and offered excellent insulation, but they were also damp, prone to collapse, and essentially underground. Many families built dugouts as temporary shelter while constructing more permanent homes, though some lived in them for years when circumstances didn't allow for upgrades. The fireplace and chimney deserved careful attention because errors could be fatal. A poorly constructed fireplace might fail to draw properly, filling your cabin with smoke. A poorly constructed chimney might catch fire, igniting the wooden structure around it. Many early chimneys were built from sticks and mud, a technique called catted construction, which worked adequately but required constant vigilance and occasional rebuilding when the mud lining cracked. Stone or brick chimneys were safer but far more labour-intensive to construct. You remember the moment your cabin was finally habitable, that first night spent inside rather than under open sky or makeshift lean-to. The walls weren't perfectly sealed. The roof dripped in one corner during rain. The fireplace smoked when the wind blew from the north. But it was shelter, actual shelter, created from nothing by your own labour and whatever help neighbours could spare. The satisfaction of that achievement lives in your memory still, a reminder that you can build what you need when circumstances demand. Building skills extended beyond initial construction to ongoing maintenance and improvement. Logs settled, shifted, rotted, chinking cracked, and fell out. Roofs needed patches and eventually replacement. A frontier dwelling was never finished. It was a continuous project, always requiring attention, always slightly at war with weather and time. You developed relationships with your materials, understanding how particular logs behaved in particular weather, knowing which corner always seemed to need rechinking after storms. The cabin around you now, small as it is, represents hundreds of hours of labour and the accumulated wisdom of generations of builders who figured out how to create shelter from wilderness. Every log carries the memory of felling and hauling. Every notch remembers the careful fitting and refitting until the joint sat true. The fire crackling in the hearth warms a space that you made, and that making connects you to something fundamental about human survival. We build, we shelter, we persist. The clothes on your back might save your life today, or they might be completely inadequate for what winter throws at you. In either case, you made them yourself, or someone in your community did, because the concept of buying mass-produced clothing from a store doesn't exist out here. The process of creating garments from raw materials was so labour-intensive that frontier families spent significant portions of their lives just keeping themselves clothed, and the shortcuts people took when that labour proved impossible sometimes meant freezing to death. Let's trace the path from sheep to sweater. because understanding this process reveals just how much work lay between nakedness and warmth. If you were fortunate enough to own sheep, not everyone was, the cycle began with spring shearing. Using hand shears that looked somewhat like oversized scissors, you'd remove the fleece in one piece if possible, taking care not to cut the animal in the process. A skilled shearer might process a dozen sheep in a day. A beginner might manage 3 or 4 while accumulating various nicks and curses. The raw fleece was filthy, matted with lanolin, manure, vegetable matter and whatever else the sheep had encountered. Cleaning it required multiple washes in warm water, sometimes with added soap or wood ash, lye, scrubbing and rinsing until the wool emerged reasonably white and soft. This washing also removed much of the natural lanolin, which had waterproofing properties, so some spinners deliberately left their wool slightly greasy. Carding came next. The cleaned wool was combed between 2 flat paddles studded with fine wire teeth, aligning the fibres in parallel and creating soft rolls called rolags. These rolags were then spun into yarn, either using a drop spindle, a weighted stick that twisted the fibres as it fell, or a spinning wheel, which mechanised the twisting process but still required considerable skill to operate smoothly. Spinning converted raw fibre into usable yarn through the application of twist, which bound the individual fibres together into a continuous strand. A single shirt might require a full pound of yarn, a heavy winter garment considerably more. Producing that yarn from raw fleece represented days of labour even for an experienced spinner. The spinning wheel hummed through long winter evenings, turning while the spinner's hands fed fibre and controlled tension. The monotonous work made bearable by conversation, songs, or the simple satisfaction of watching yarn accumulate on the bobbin. Weaving transformed yarn into fabric, and this required even more specialised equipment. A proper loom, a wooden frame with various moving parts for lifting warp threads and beating weft threads into place, might cost more than everything else in your cabin combined. Not everyone owned one. Communities often shared looms, with one family maintaining the equipment and accepting yarn in exchange for weaving services. If you couldn't access a loom, you might knit your garments instead, a slower process but one requiring much simpler tools. Historians still argue whether frontier women spent more time spinning or weaving, and the answer probably varied by region, era, and individual circumstance. What's clear is that textile production consumed enormous amounts of female labour. Estimates suggest that keeping a typical family clothed might require 1,000 hours of work annually just for spinning and weaving, not counting all the other steps before and after. Here's a quirky detail. The colour of your clothing was far from arbitrary. Undyed wool came in various natural shades from white through brown to nearly black, depending on the sheep breed. Dyeing required additional labour and materials, plants that produced colour, mordants that fixed dyes to fibres, and considerable experimentation to achieve consistent results. Blue dye from indigo was popular but expensive, often imported. Yellow came from various local plants including goldenrod and black walnut. Red was difficult and precious. Many frontier garments remained undyed, their natural cream or brown serving perfectly well for practical purposes. Animal hides provided an alternative to woven fabrics, particularly for winter outerwear. Leather and fur were warmer, more durable, and more water-resistant than most homespun cloth. But processing hides was its own lengthy ordeal. The hide needed to be scraped clean of flesh and fat, then treated to prevent rotting. Various tanning methods existed. Brain tanning, using the animal's own brain tissue worked into the hide. Vegetable tanning, using bark and other plant materials. Smoke tanning, which created distinctively coloured and scented leather. Brain tanning, often learned from Native American neighbours, produced soft, supple buckskin that was ideal for clothing. The process was labour-intensive but required no purchased materials. The brain was an integral part of the deer you'd already killed, and working it into the scraped hide over several days created leather that moved with the body and could be washed without stiffening. Many frontier families preferred brain-tanned buckskin for hard-use garments like hunting shirts and leggings. The garments themselves were designed for durability and practicality rather than fashion. Multiple layers allowed for temperature adjustment. A linen or cotton undergarment, often called a shift for women or a shirt for men, provided a washable layer against the skin. Outer garments, wool dresses, hunting shirts, trousers were laundered far less frequently. Vests and jackets added insulation. Cloaks, capes and blanket coats provided outer protection against wind and precipitation. Footwear deserved special attention because cold, wet feet could disable or kill. Leather shoes or boots, made by family members or purchased from travelling cobblers, needed to be kept oiled and dry. Moccasins, learned from native example, were quieter and more comfortable for forest work. Multiple pairs were essential because drying wet footwear took time, and wearing wet shoes guaranteed misery. Wool socks, hand-knitted and frequently darned, protected feet within whatever outer covering you could manage. The threat of cold weather clothing failure was very real. Inadequate insulation led to hypothermia, which progressed through shivering, confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually death. Wet clothing accelerated heat loss dramatically. This is why cotton, which absorbs water readily and loses its insulating properties when wet, was far less valuable for outdoor work than wool, which retains warmth even when damp. Frontier folk understood this intuitively, even without the technical vocabulary. Your current outfit, as you prepare for the day's outdoor work, includes several layers that represent considerable labour. The wool shirt against your skin came from sheep raised 2 farms over, traded for labour during the harvest. The hunting shirt over it was made from deer hide you brain-tanned yourself last autumn, its fringe not decorative but functional. The hanging strips channeled water away from the body rather than letting it soak in. Your trousers are worn but serviceable, patched in several places where hard use has worn through the original fabric. Keeping clothes in wearable condition was its own ongoing task. Buttons needed replacing, seams needed restitching, patches needed applying. Every family had a sewing kit containing needles, precious items that were never discarded even when rusted or bent, thread, spare fabric scraps, and whatever fasteners could be obtained. Mending happened in spare moments, during the evening hours when the light was too dim for other detailed work, during the winter days when outdoor labour was impossible. Children's clothing presented special challenges because children grew, often rapidly. A dress or suit that fit perfectly in autumn might be hopelessly small by spring. Garments were made large and hemmed up, then let down as the child grew. Hand-me-downs passed from older to younger siblings, then to cousins, then to neighbours' children, worn until they literally fell apart. New garments for children were rare luxuries. Most kids wore what previous generations had worn before them. The clothes you're wearing right now are warm enough for a few hours of outdoor work, assuming you stay active and don't get wet. The woodpile awaits, and splitting logs generates enough body heat to compensate for marginal insulation. But you're always aware, always calculating. How long can I stay out? How quickly can I get back inside? What happens if I fall through ice or get caught in sudden weather? The answers to these questions determine whether you live or die, and your clothing is central to every calculation. The sky outside your cabin door tells you everything you need to know about the coming day, but only if you know how to read it. Those clouds piling up on the western horizon, the particular quality of the morning light, the way sound carries across the frozen landscape, all of these carry information that could save your life or cost you dearly if ignored. Without weather forecasts, without barometers or thermometers or satellite imagery, your ancestors developed an intimate literacy of atmospheric signs that most modern humans have completely lost. You step outside, and the first thing you notice is the smell. Snow is coming. You can smell it. That particular metallic crispness that precedes a storm. This isn't mysticism, it's chemistry. Changing atmospheric pressure affects how odours travel, and an approaching low-pressure system carries scents differently than stable high pressure. Your nose, after months of winter observation, has learned to detect these subtle shifts. Scientists wouldn't fully explain this phenomenon until the 20th century, but frontier folk had been using it for generations. The clouds themselves speak volumes. Those flat-bottomed cumulus puffs on a summer afternoon mean fair weather, at least for a few hours. But when they start building vertically, developing the anvil-shaped tops meteorologists call cumulonimbus, you'd better get inside because serious weather is coming. Cirrus clouds, those high, wispy streaks that look like horsetails, often precede weather changes by a day or two. Mare's tails and mackerel scales make tall ships take in their sails. The old rhyme encoded practical wisdom that sailors and farmers had accumulated over centuries. The wind direction matters enormously, and experienced weather watchers tracked it constantly. In the regions you're likely inhabiting, weather generally moves from west to east, so what's happening to your west will reach you eventually. A wind shifting from west to south often indicated warming and potential precipitation. A wind shifting to the north meant colder air arriving. The strength of the wind also mattered. Increasing wind frequently preceded storms, while the eerie stillness before certain thunderstorms warned of severe weather building. Animal behaviour provided additional weather cues that settlers learned to interpret. Birds flying low often meant precipitation approaching, because the insects they hunted flew lower in falling pressure. Cows lying down in pastures supposedly indicated rain, though this particular folk wisdom has been questioned by modern researchers. What's more certain is that animals could detect environmental changes that humans missed, and observant settlers noticed correlations even if they couldn't explain them. Historians still argue whether folk weather prediction methods were genuinely effective or largely confirmation bias. People remembered the times when animal behaviour preceded storms and forgot the times when it didn't. The answer is probably both. Some folk methods reflected real atmospheric phenomena, while others were essentially superstition. Without controlled studies, frontier people couldn't distinguish reliable from unreliable signs, so they paid attention to everything and hoped for the best. Here's a quirky detail that actually works. The way smoke rises from your chimney can predict weather. On clear, stable days, smoke rises straight up in a defined column. When a low-pressure system approaches, smoke tends to swirl and flatten, behaving differently as atmospheric pressure and humidity change. You've probably never consciously noticed this before, but now that you're living without forecasts, you watch your chimney like a weather vane, noting how the smoke behaves and what follows. Your body itself became a weather instrument, though not always a welcome one. Joint pain often preceded storms, particularly for those with arthritis or previous injuries. This phenomenon is real. Changes in barometric pressure affect the fluid in joints, creating discomfort that serves as a physical weather forecast. Old farmers who could feel it in their bones weren't imagining things. They were detecting atmospheric changes through a biological sensitivity that younger, healthier bodies couldn't match. The moon and stars offered their own weather information. A ring around the moon, called a lunar halo, often preceded rain or snow, because the high ice crystals that create the optical effect also indicate moisture moving through the upper atmosphere. The clarity of starlight varied with humidity and pressure, and experienced skywatchers could distinguish the sharp stars of clear, stable nights from the softer, hazier stars that suggested weather changes approaching. Seasonal weather patterns created a framework within which daily variations occurred. You learned when to expect the first and last frosts, when the spring floods typically came, when summer droughts were most likely. This long-range knowledge couldn't predict specific storms, but it shaped your planning throughout the year. Plant too early, and late frost killed your crops. Plant too late, and early fall frost caught plants before maturity. The timing windows were narrow, and mistakes were costly. Weather preparation became reflexive. Before starting any task that would take you far from shelter, you assessed the sky, the wind, the temperature, the overall feel of the air. If conditions seemed stable, you proceeded. If they seemed threatening, you adjusted plans. This constant meteorological awareness consumed mental energy, but prevented the worst outcomes. Being caught in a blizzard miles from home, starting a hunting trip just before a days-long storm, or failing to harvest crops before damaging weather arrived. The consequences of weather prediction failures could be severe. Stories circulated of travellers caught in sudden blizzards who froze within sight of shelter, disoriented by the whiteout conditions and unable to cover the final 100 yards. Farmers who misread spring weather and planted too early lost entire crops to late freezes. Families who failed to recognise approaching storms didn't complete their preservation work in time and faced hungry winters. Your reading of this morning's weather suggests you have a few hours before the approaching system arrives. The clouds are building but still distant. The wind is steady but not yet strengthening, and the smell of snow is present but not urgent. This gives you time to complete essential outdoor tasks, checking those snares, splitting some wood, perhaps patching that troublesome section of chinking, before you'll need to be safely inside. You've also learned to prepare for weather that surprises your predictions, because sometimes the sky lies. Emergency supplies stayed near the cabin door, extra firewood already split, water stored inside, a rope connecting house to outhouse and house to barn if you had livestock. Blizzards could arrive faster than even skilled observers expected, reducing visibility to arm's length within minutes. Having preparation already in place meant survival even when prediction failed. The relationship between weather and mood deserved attention too. Long stretches of grey, cold winter days affected mental state in ways that could compromise survival. Seasonal depression wasn't recognised as a medical condition, but its effects were real. Families developed strategies, saving special foods for the darkest weeks, planning indoor projects that provided accomplishment and distraction, visiting neighbours when weather permitted to break the isolation. The weather didn't just threaten your body, it threatened your will to continue. As you stand in your doorway, reading the sky with skills your ancestors developed and passed down, you feel connected to something ancient. Humans have been watching clouds and feeling wind shifts for as long as there have been humans. This morning's weather assessment links you to every hunter, every farmer, every sailor who ever looked up and wondered what was coming. The forecast is snow by afternoon, significant accumulation possible, temperatures dropping further tonight. You'd better get moving. The nearest doctor is 3 days' ride away, and even if you could reach him in time, his treatments might well kill you faster than whatever ailment brought you to his office. This was the brutal reality of medical care in 1800s America, where illness and injury presented challenges that modern people can barely imagine, and where survival often depended on folk remedies, desperate improvisation, and pure luck. Your cabin contains a small chest of medicinal supplies, assembled over time from your own gathering, trading with neighbours, and occasional purchases from travelling peddlers. The contents would look strange to modern eyes. Dried herbs in paper packets, bottles of mysterious liquids, a collection of implements that hover somewhere between tools and torture devices. This is your medical kit, the sum total of healing technology available to you, and it represents both accumulated wisdom and considerable dangerous nonsense. Let's start with the herbs, because botanical medicine formed the backbone of frontier healthcare. Willow bark, which you collected yourself from trees along the creek, contains salicin, the compound that would eventually be refined into aspirin. Chewed or brewed into tea, it genuinely reduced pain and fever, and frontier families used it liberally for headaches, toothaches, and the general misery of infectious illness. You didn't know why it worked, but you knew that it did, and that knowledge passed from generation to generation. Elderflower tea was a standard treatment for colds and respiratory congestion, believed to induce sweating and break fevers. Modern research suggests elderflower does have mild antiviral properties, though probably not enough to significantly affect disease outcomes. Still, the warm liquid provided hydration and comfort. The ritual of preparation gave patients something to hope for, and these psychological benefits shouldn't be dismissed as unimportant. Yarrow, that common meadow plant with its flat clusters of tiny white flowers, served as a wound treatment. Applied directly to cuts and scrapes, it helped slow bleeding, a property confirmed by modern investigation of its chemical compounds. It was also brewed into tea for digestive complaints, used in baths for skin conditions, and generally considered a useful plant to have available. Many frontier families cultivated small medicine gardens where they grew yarrow alongside other healing plants. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Tobacco was widely used as medicine throughout the 1800s, applied as poultices for insect bites and stings, burned to fumigate sick rooms, and even administered as enemas for various digestive complaints. The practice seems bizarre now that we understand tobacco's dangers, but it reflected the medical theory of the time, which saw tobacco as a powerful plant capable of affecting the body's humours. We now know it was affecting the body, just not in therapeutic ways. Historians still argue whether frontier medical practices did more harm than good overall. The answer is genuinely complicated. Herbal treatments range from effective, willow bark, to useless, many supposed fever treatments, to actively harmful, various mercury and arsenic preparations. Surgical interventions were sometimes necessary and successful, but were also performed without anaesthesia, antiseptics, or reliable technique. The net effect on population health is difficult to calculate, but it's safe to say that many people who received medical treatment would have been better off receiving none. The theory behind medical treatment in this era was humoral medicine, an ancient Greek system holding that the body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that needed to remain in balance for health. Illness indicated imbalance, and treatment aimed to restore balance through purging, bleeding, sweating, or other interventions designed to remove excess humours. This theory was completely wrong, but it provided a coherent framework that made sense to practitioners and patients alike. Bloodletting was standard treatment for many conditions. based on the idea that illness often involved excess blood that needed removal. Doctors might open a vein and drain significant quantities, sometimes pints, leaving patients weak and pale but supposedly better balanced. In reality, bloodletting was almost never helpful and frequently harmful, weakening patients who needed all their strength to fight infection. George Washington's death is partly attributed to excessive bloodletting during his final illness. Doctors removed nearly half his blood volume over 2 days. Purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea through powerful drugs, was another common intervention, meant to expel harmful substances from the body. Calomel, a mercury compound, was perhaps the most common purging agent despite being actually poisonous. Patients who survived their original illness while taking calomel might develop mercury poisoning instead, losing teeth and suffering neurological damage from their treatment. Surgical capabilities were limited but not absent. Frontier practitioners could set broken bones with reasonable skill, lance abscesses, extract problematic teeth, and amputate limbs when necessary. The last was particularly significant because crushing injuries, severe infections, and snake bites sometimes left amputation as the only option for survival. These procedures were performed without anesthesia. Ether and chloroform wouldn't come into common use until the 1840s and 1850s, meaning patients endured full consciousness throughout. The pain management options available to you right now if you're injured include alcohol, which dulls sensation somewhat, opiates if you can obtain them, effective but addictive and dangerous, and simply gritting your teeth while someone performs necessary procedures. Patients were sometimes given wooden objects to bite, strapped down to prevent movement, and operated on as quickly as possible to minimize their suffering. Surgical speed was a genuine skill, and reputations were made by practitioners who could complete amputations in minutes. Childbirth represented a particularly dangerous medical event, responsible for significant maternal and infant mortality throughout the era. Midwives attended most births, using accumulated wisdom that often served women well, positioning for easier delivery, patience for natural labour progression, comfort measures that eased pain without drugs, but complications that modern obstetrics would handle routinely, breech presentation, prolonged labour, postpartum hemorrhage, could easily prove fatal when no effective interventions existed. The psychological dimension of frontier medicine shouldn't be underestimated. Believing that treatment would help actually helped, through mechanisms we now understand as placebo effects. Patients who felt cared for, who had explanations for their suffering, who participated in rituals of healing, recovered better than patients who simply suffered alone. This is one reason why even ineffective treatments persisted. They provided psychological benefits that genuine physical outcomes couldn't entirely dismiss. Your medicine chest also contains a few purchased items: laudanum, an opium tincture that provided genuine pain relief and was used for everything from toothaches to dysentery. Dr. Somebody's patent medicine, whose mysterious contents probably include alcohol and possibly opiates, and a small amount of quinine, effective against malaria and therefore precious in areas where that disease was common. These commercial products range from genuinely useful to outright fraud, and you had no reliable way to distinguish one from the other. When you get sick, and you will get sick because everyone did, you'll face the fundamental frontier medical dilemma. Treat yourself with whatever remedies you have available, or wait and hope your body resolves the problem on its own. Often, waiting was actually the better choice, because the body's immune system was more effective than most available treatments. But knowing when to intervene and when to wait required judgment that even trained physicians frequently got wrong. The fire crackles, your medicine chest sits closed in its corner, and for now you're healthy enough. But you're also aware that this could change at any moment. A cut that becomes infected, a fall that breaks bones, an illness that arrives without warning. The frontier asked for self-sufficiency in medical care, just as it asked for self-sufficiency in everything else, and the stakes for failure were extraordinarily high. You're thinking about the snares you set 3 days ago, out beyond the far woodlot in that little clearing where rabbit trails converge. Getting there requires walking about 2 miles through unmarked forest, which wouldn't be particularly challenging except that getting lost in wilderness this fast could actually kill you. Navigation without maps, compasses, or GPS was a fundamental frontier skill, and the techniques your ancestors used to find their way deserve more appreciation than they typically receive. The most reliable navigational tool was familiarity. Knowing the land so intimately, that you recognized individual trees, rock formations, and terrain features as landmarks. After months or years in one location, you developed mental maps that guided you through your regular territory without conscious thought. That distinctive split oak marked the halfway point to the stream. The rocky outcrop that looked vaguely like a face indicated where deer trails converged. The slight dip in the ridgeline showed where the best crossing point lay. But what about unfamiliar territory? What about situations where you needed to travel beyond your known landscape? Here, more general techniques became necessary, and the most famous, moss growing on the north side of trees, was actually somewhat unreliable. Moss grows where conditions suit it, which often means the shaded side of trees, which is often but not always north. In deep forest, moisture and light conditions varied enough that moss provided inconsistent guidance at best. More reliable was the sun, whose arc across the sky offered directional information throughout daylight hours. In the northern hemisphere, the sun rose generally east, travelled south, and set generally west, with seasonal variations that experienced navigators learned to account for. A stick stuck vertically in the ground would cast a shadow pointing roughly north at midday. The time elapsed since sunrise or until sunset indicated whether you were walking toward or away from particular directions. Stars offered nighttime navigation, and the North Star, Polaris, provided the most reliable reference point available. Finding Polaris was straightforward if you knew the Big Dipper. Extend a line through the two stars at the end of the Dipper's cup, and it points toward the North Star. Polaris sits almost exactly at celestial north, remaining nearly stationary while other stars rotate around it, making it a reliable reference throughout the night regardless of season. Historians still argue whether European-American settlers developed their navigation techniques independently or adopted them significantly from indigenous peoples who had navigated these lands for millennia. The evidence suggests extensive knowledge transfer, sometimes acknowledged and sometimes not. Native American guides were essential to early exploration and continued providing navigation services throughout the frontier period, their expertise often making the difference between successful journeys and disasters. Here's a quirky detail about frontier navigation. Rivers were perhaps the most important directional indicators, not because they ran in consistent directions, they don't, but because following a river downstream inevitably led somewhere. Rivers accumulated into larger rivers, which flowed towards settlements, trade posts, or at least the sea. If you were hopelessly lost, finding a watercourse and following it downstream was sound survival strategy. You might walk for days, but you wouldn't walk in circles. The terrain itself offered navigational clues. Ridgetops ran in generally consistent directions and provided clear sight lines for orientation. Valleys funneled travellers along predictable routes. Animal trails often followed the easiest paths through difficult terrain and might lead to water sources or meadows. Reading the landscape as a navigational text required practice, but the alphabet was available to anyone willing to learn. Your route to the snare line follows a sequence of landmarks you've memorized. From the cabin door, head toward the notched oak visible at the forest edge. From there, walk until you reach the dry creek bed and follow it upstream past the boulder shaped like a loaf of bread. Continue until the creek bed turns sharply east, then leave it and climb the slight rise to the clearing where you've placed your snares. Each leg of this journey takes about 20 minutes, and if you somehow miss a landmark, you backtrack to the last one you're certain of. The journey out is relatively safe because you know where you're going. The journey back is safer still because you simply reverse the sequence. The danger comes from unexpected events, sudden weather that erases visibility, injury that prevents normal travel, pursuit by predators or humans that forces you off your planned route. For these situations, you carry a few emergency navigation items. A small compass, if you're fortunate enough to own one, a piece of flint and steel for emergency fire, and a length of cord that could be used for shelter construction or other survival needs. Getting lost, truly lost, was one of the most feared frontier experiences. Stories circulated of people found dead within sight of safety, having wandered in circles until exhaustion claimed them. The psychological dimension was as dangerous as the physical. Panic made poor decisions seem reasonable, and poor decisions in wilderness environments compounded rapidly into catastrophe. Experienced woodsmen cultivated calm as a survival skill, sitting down to think when disorientation struck rather than thrashing forward into deeper confusion. Children were particularly vulnerable to getting lost. and frontier families developed strategies for prevention and response. Some attached small bells to children's clothing, allowing their location to be tracked by sound. Others established clear boundaries that children were forbidden to cross alone. When children did go missing, entire communities mobilized for searches, understanding that time was essential and that finding a lost child quickly might mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. The navigational skills you're using today, reading terrain, following landmarks, maintaining directional awareness, seem almost primitive compared to GPS technology. But they work. They've worked for thousands of years for every human culture that travelled across landscapes without electronic assistance. And there's something satisfying about the competence, about knowing that you can find your way through wilderness using nothing but your eyes, your memory, and the patterns nature provides. You're walking now, following the route you've memorized, the morning light filtering through bare branches and creating patterns on the snow that you've learned to read for information about wind direction and weather changes. The notched oak appears right where you expected it. The dry creek bed emerges from the forest floor exactly on schedule. The landmarks are keeping their promises, and you're navigating your world with skills that connect you to every traveller who ever crossed wild country without a map in their pocket. The path to your snare line takes you through prime predator territory, and you're acutely aware of this fact with every step. The forests of 1800s, America teemed with animals quite willing to eat you: wolves, mountain lions, black bears and grizzlies in western territories, alongside smaller but still dangerous creatures like venomous snakes and disease-carrying insects. Defense against these threats required constant vigilance and an array of techniques that went far beyond simply carrying a gun. Your rifle rests across your shoulder as you walk, loaded and primed, ready to fire within seconds if necessary. But a single-shot muzzleloader has significant limitations as predator defense. It takes time to reload, misses happen under stress, and some animals require multiple shots to bring down. Experienced frontier people understood that their firearm was important but not sufficient, and they developed supplementary strategies for coexisting with dangerous wildlife. The first strategy was avoidance, understanding animal behaviour well enough to minimize dangerous encounters. Most predators don't want to interact with humans any more than you want to interact with them. Wolves, despite their terrifying reputation, rarely attack adult humans and generally flee when they detect human presence. Making noise while walking, singing, talking, deliberately stepping on crunchy debris, alerts animals to your approach and gives them time to retreat before confrontation becomes necessary. Bears present a more complex situation. Black bears, the most common species in eastern forests, are generally shy and can be scared off with aggressive displays, shouting, waving arms, appearing large and threatening. But female bears with cubs, or bears accustomed to human food, behave unpredictably and dangerously. The advice to never run from a bear is ancient wisdom. Running triggers chase instincts, and you cannot outrun a bear. Standing your ground, backing away slowly, and avoiding direct eye contact usually works. But usually is cold comfort when facing several hundred pounds of muscle and teeth. Historians still argue whether wolf attacks on humans in frontier America were common occurrences or rare events exaggerated by folklore. The evidence is genuinely mixed. Documented attacks exist, but they're far fewer than contemporary accounts suggested, and many reports may have been embellished or fabricated. What's clear is that frontier people feared wolves intensely, and this fear shaped behaviour regardless of actual risk levels. Here's a quirky detail about frontier pest management. Certain herbs and plants were believed to repel dangerous animals, and whether or not these beliefs had scientific validity, they shaped how people moved through the landscape. Sage, tobacco smoke, and certain pungent plants were thought to deter snakes. Carrying these materials offered psychological comfort, if nothing else, and the rituals of preparation, stuffing herbs in pockets, keeping tobacco handy, provided a sense of agency against forces largely beyond human control. Fire served as perhaps the most reliable animal deterrent. Most wildlife avoids flames and smoke instinctively, and maintaining a fire through the night while camping provided reasonable protection against predator approach. The fire also provided light, warning against snakes and other ground-dwelling dangers that might be invisible in darkness. Many frontier travellers carried fire-starting supplies as essential gear, recognizing that the ability to create flame might determine survival in predator-heavy territories. Domestic animals served defensive as well as economic purposes. Dogs, particularly, functioned as early warning systems against predator approach. Their superior senses detected threats long before human awareness, and their barking provided both warning and deterrent. Many frontier families kept multiple dogs for exactly this reason, accepting the cost of feeding them as investment in security. The sound of a dog barking at night might indicate anything from a passing raccoon to an approaching mountain lion, and prudent families investigated rather than ignored the alarm. Insects presented different challenges than large predators but could be equally deadly. Mosquitoes carried malaria and yellow fever, killing thousands annually in lowland and swampy regions. The connection between mosquitoes and disease wasn't fully understood until the late 1800s, but practical observation had established that swampy areas were unhealthy, and sensible settlers avoided building homes in such locations when alternatives existed. Smoke provided the most reliable protection against biting insects. Smoky fires near living areas drove mosquitoes away, and smudge pots, containers producing steady smoke without significant heat, could protect outdoor work areas. Some frontier people applied various oily or aromatic substances to their skin as insect repellents, with varying effectiveness. Pennyroyal, citronella, and similar strong-scented plants were believed to help, and some probably did offer modest protection. Ticks carried their own dangers, transmitting diseases that wouldn't be properly identified for another century, but that sickened frontier people regularly. The technique of checking your body for ticks after moving through tall grass or brushy areas was survival wisdom that most families practiced. Removing ticks promptly, carefully, to avoid leaving mouth parts embedded, reduced disease transmission risk. Though nobody understood the mechanism, venomous snakes, rattlesnakes, copperheads, water moccasins, depending on region, presented acute danger to anyone walking through their territory. Heavy boots offered some protection, as did walking carefully in areas where snakes might rest. Rock piles, fallen logs, sunny patches where cold-blooded creatures warmed themselves. Snakebite treatment in this era was largely useless or harmful. Cutting and sucking wounds, applying various poultices, drinking whiskey, and most survivors recovered despite rather than because of treatment. Your walk to the snare line takes you through exactly the kind of habitat where wildlife encounters are possible. The forest edge, where clearing meets trees, attracts deer that attract predators. The brushy undergrowth provides cover for snakes and denning sites for various mammals. You walk alert, scanning for movement, listening for sounds that indicate animal presence. The rifle is ready, but you're hoping you won't need it, for the noise would scare away the rabbits you're hoping to find in your snares. The balance between fear and function was something frontier people had to manage daily. Excessive fear paralyzed necessary activity. Insufficient fear led to careless deaths. Finding the appropriate level of vigilance, aware but not anxious, cautious but not incapacitated, was itself a survival skill that developed through experience. You've reached that balance now, walking with purpose through potentially dangerous territory, confident in your ability to handle whatever you encounter, but not foolish enough to imagine yourself invulnerable. The snare line check is done, 2 rabbits, a good morning's yield, and you're walking back toward the cabin when the silence hits you. Not the normal winter quiet, but something different, heavier, a stillness that presses against your consciousness and demands attention. This is the loneliness of frontier life, the psychological isolation that broke minds as readily as physical hardships broke bodies, and your ancestors developed survival strategies for this internal wilderness just as they did for the external one. Let's be honest about the isolation most frontier families faced. Your nearest neighbours live several miles away, close enough for occasional visits, but far enough that casual socialising is impractical. Days pass without seeing another human face. Weeks might pass without substantial conversation beyond your immediate family. If you have family, many settlers were single men, utterly alone except for rare trading encounters. This solitude could be peaceful or crushing depending on temperament and circumstances, and the line between the two was often thinner than people expected. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation are well documented now, but were poorly understood in the 1800s. People knew that cabin fever was real, the restlessness, irritability, and occasional derangement that set in during long winters of enforced indoor confinement, but they didn't have therapeutic frameworks for understanding or addressing it. What they had instead were practical strategies that emerged from accumulated experience. Work helped. Constant labour, while exhausting, provided structure and purpose that kept minds occupied. The frontier offered endless projects, improving your cabin, preparing tools, making and mending clothing, processing food supplies. Idle hands might be the devil's workshop, as the saying went, but the deeper wisdom was that idle minds in isolated circumstances tended toward dark places. Keeping busy was survival strategy as much as productivity. Historians still argue whether frontier isolation contributed to the religious intensity characteristic of the period, or whether religious belief helped people survive isolation they might otherwise not have endured. Both explanations probably contain truth. Faith provided meaning, community, even if that community was with an invisible God, and hope that present suffering served larger purposes. Prayer and Bible reading filled otherwise empty hours, and the certainty of divine presence countered the absence of human presence. Here's a quirky detail about frontier mental health. Talking to animals was completely normal and probably beneficial. Your dog, your horse, your chickens, these creatures provided companionship that wasn't trivial, and carrying on one-sided conversations with them offered verbal expression that might otherwise have no outlet. The frontier was full of people who addressed their livestock with elaborate courtesy, not because they were crazy, but because they needed someone to talk to. Visiting neighbours, when possible, took on significance that modern people might not appreciate. A trip to the nearest homestead might consume an entire day, but the conversation and human contact gained were worth the investment. Frontier communities developed elaborate visiting customs, hospitality for travellers, reciprocal visits, gatherings that provided social contact in concentrated doses. When a neighbour fell ill and couldn't visit, someone would check on them. And this checking wasn't just medical concern, but psychological intervention. The pattern of seasonal socialisation emerged from necessity. Summer and autumn, with their crushing workloads, offered little time for extended visiting. But winter, despite its dangers, provided leisure hours when social gatherings became possible. Quilting bees, barn dances, house raisings, church services. These events clustered in slower seasons, providing concentrated human contact that sustained people through the isolation of busier times. Music played a surprisingly important role in frontier mental health. Families who owned instruments, fiddles, harmonicas, simple drums, used them regularly, and the psychological benefits of music extended beyond entertainment. Singing while working made monotonous labour more bearable. Group singing at gatherings created emotional bonds between participants. Even listening to someone else play provided pleasure that cut through the greyness of isolated existence. The tradition of folk music on the frontier wasn't just cultural expression, it was psychological survival. Reading materials were treasured far beyond their content value. A single book might be read dozens of times, memorised and quoted, discussed in detail during rare social encounters. Newspapers arrived weeks or months late but were consumed completely. Every article and advertisement studied for connection to the larger world. The hunger for information about life beyond your immediate horizon was intense, and any scrap of news from elsewhere provided mental nourishment. Children presented particular psychological challenges in isolated settings. They needed socialization with peers for normal development, but peers might not exist within practical distance. Parents improvised, creating elaborate games, telling stories, inventing educational activities, trying to provide stimulation that would normally come from broader social contact. Some frontier children grew up remarkably well adjusted. Others carried lifelong marks of isolation that affected their social functioning. The depression that sometimes claimed frontier people wasn't usually called depression. It was melancholy, or the doldrums, or simply not discussed at all. But it was real, and it was dangerous. People stopped eating, stopped working, stopped caring about survival in ways that almost inevitably led to death, in environments that punished any lapse in self-maintenance. Families watched for these signs in each other, sometimes forcing unwilling relatives to eat, work, or travel to neighbours when the darkness seemed to be closing in. You're feeling something like this now, walking back through the silent forest with your rabbits and your thoughts. The isolation isn't unbearable. You're managing, you've been managing, but you're aware of its weight, the cumulative pressure of days and weeks without meaningful human contact. The cabin will be empty when you return. The evening will pass in solitude. Tomorrow will bring the same silence. But you've developed strategies. Tonight you'll work on that broken harness, a project requiring enough concentration to occupy your mind. You'll read a few pages from the one book you own, savouring the words like rare food. You'll talk to the fire as it crackles, narrating your day to no one, hearing your own voice break the silence even if no one answers. And next week, weather permitting, you'll make the trip to the Henderson place, 5 miles south, where human conversation and borrowed books await. The frontier demanded psychological resilience alongside physical toughness, and surviving alone required techniques that aren't obvious until you need them. You're walking back toward an empty cabin, but you're walking with purpose, with plans, with strategies that turn isolation into solitude and solitude into something bearable. The silence surrounds you, but it hasn't consumed you. Not yet, not today, maybe not ever if you keep finding ways to push it back. The rabbits you're carrying represent more than tonight's dinner. They represent skills taught to you when you were barely old enough to understand them. Children on the frontier weren't protected from work. They were essential to it, contributing labour from ages that modern people would consider shockingly young. By 6, you were learning tasks that would save your life. By 10, you were performing them competently. By 14, you could survive alone if circumstances demanded. This wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. And the children who emerged from frontier upbringing carried competencies that defined their adult lives. The division of labour by age was remarkably consistent across frontier families, because the logic of it was inescapable. Toddlers could gather eggs, pull weeds, carry messages between nearby adults. Children of 5 or 6 could fetch water, tend fires, watch younger siblings. By 8, most children could cook simple meals, help with livestock, and perform basic repairs. By 12, the gender division that would characterise adult work was largely in place. Boys hunting, farming and building, girls spinning, cooking and managing household production. Education happened continuously, embedded in daily tasks rather than separated into classroom hours. You learned to identify plants by gathering them with your mother. You learned to handle tools by watching your father and being allowed gradually increasing responsibility. You learned to read, if you learned at all, through family instruction and occasional schooling when teachers became available. Many frontier children received minimal formal education but extensive practical training that prepared them for lives that would require exactly those skills. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates the seriousness with which children's contributions were treated. Many frontier children had personal tools scaled to their size. Small axes, small hoes, small spinning implements allowed children to perform real work rather than just pretending. A child's first knife was a milestone occasion, marking entry into a world of increased responsibility and increased danger. Parents accepted that accidents would happen, cuts and bruises were constant companions of frontier childhood, but the alternative of raising helpless children was worse. Historians still argue whether frontier childhood was traumatic or merely different from modern childhood, and the answer probably depends heavily on individual circumstances. Some children thrived in environments that demanded their contributions and respected their growing competences. Others were overwhelmed by responsibilities beyond their abilities, by losses of family members to disease or accident, by hardships that no child should have to face. Frontier childhood was neither idyllic nor uniformly terrible. It was varied, and generalizations obscure more than they reveal. The transition from child to adult was gradual but unmistakable. By late adolescence, young people were essentially performing adult work and were treated accordingly. Marriage happened young by modern standards, 16 or 17 for girls, late teens to early 20s for boys, because economic independence required partnership, and partnership meant establishing new households. Childhood ended not at some arbitrary age, but when adult competencies had been demonstrated and adult responsibilities had been assumed. Death touched frontier children more frequently than modern sensibilities can easily comprehend. Infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps 1/3 of children died before reaching their 5th birthday, and the survivors knew siblings, cousins and friends who hadn't made it. This constant proximity to death shaped children's understanding of life's fragility, and perhaps contributed to the seriousness with which they approached their responsibilities. When every skill might someday mean the difference between living and dying, learning took on urgency that mere curiosity couldn't provide. Play existed, of course, but often blended with practical skill development. Games involving throwing, aiming and stalking prepared children for hunting. Sewing dolls prepared girls for textile work. Building play structures practiced construction techniques. The division between work and play was permeable in ways that modern childhood, with its sharp separations, doesn't typically allow. Your own childhood, if you're imagining yourself as a frontier settler, probably included moments of genuine joy, alongside the labour and danger. Summer afternoons, swimming in the creek after chores were done, winter evenings listening to stories around the fire, the satisfaction of mastering new skills and receiving adult recognition for competence. Frontier childhood wasn't all grimness and a toil, but neither was it the protected, supervised experience that modern children typically enjoy. The transition to adulthood brought new responsibilities, but also new freedoms. You could make decisions about your own labour, your own time, your own future. Marriage, if and when it came, represented establishment of your own household, your own domain to manage. The skills accumulated through childhood became the foundation of adult competence, and the confidence that came from having contributed meaningfully since early years provided psychological resources that might otherwise have been lacking. Looking back at the child you were, gathering eggs, carrying water, learning to set snares exactly like the ones you just checked, you recognise that frontier childhood prepared you for exactly this moment. Walking through winter forest, self-sufficient, capable of providing for yourself, aware of dangers but not paralysed by them. The skills aren't abstract. They're embedded in muscle memory, in reflexive competencies that don't require conscious thought. You check snares because you've checked snares since you were 10. You navigate forest because you've walked these paths since before you could read. The rabbits swing against your hip as you walk, tokens of a morning's successful work. Tonight you'll skin and clean them using techniques learned in childhood. Cook them over fire built with skills your father demonstrated when you could barely lift an axe. The chain of teaching and learning stretches back through generations, each link forged in the necessity of frontier survival. You are, in some sense, the sum of everything your family knew how to do, knowledge accumulated over lifetimes and transmitted through childhood labour that prepared you for exactly this life. Back in the cabin now, the fire rebuilt and the rabbits hanging near the hearth, you find yourself thinking about the letter you need to send. Your brother lives 200 miles west and you haven't communicated in nearly a year. The mail system exists, barely, but using it from remote locations like yours requires effort, expense, and considerable patience. Communication across the vast distances of frontier America was an exercise in creative problem-solving, and the methods people developed reveal both ingenuity and desperation. Writing a letter was itself a significant undertaking. Paper was expensive and not always available. Some frontier writers used whatever surfaces they could find, including bark, leather scraps, and the blank pages torn from books. Ink could be purchased or manufactured from various sources: oak galls, berries, soot mixed with water. Quill pens required regular cutting to maintain their points. The materials for correspondence that modern people take for granted represented real investments of money or labour for frontier families. The letter itself needed to justify this investment, which meant that frontier correspondence tended toward the dense and comprehensive. You wouldn't waste precious paper on small talk. You'd report every significant event since your last letter, provide detailed information about health, crops, finances, and local conditions, and request specific information or assistance. Letters functioned as data downloads, concentrated bursts of information meant to sustain connection across long silences. Getting your letter to its destination was the next challenge. If you lived near a town with a post office, you could simply deliver your letter there and pay postage. But postage was expensive, often paid by the recipient rather than the sender, and delivery times were measured in weeks or months rather than days. If you lived remote from postal infrastructure, you needed alternative methods, carrying letters to town yourself, entrusting them to neighbours travelling in useful directions, or waiting for passing travellers who might carry mail as a courtesy. Here's a quirky detail about frontier mail. Letters sometimes accumulated in general stores, taverns, or other gathering places, waiting for someone travelling in the right direction to carry them forward. The informal mail network supplemented the official postal system, relying on the good faith of strangers to deliver letters they had no particular obligation to deliver. Most people honoured this obligation, understanding that they too might someday depend on others' honesty to carry their correspondence. Historians still argue whether the postal system's expansion facilitated frontier settlement or followed it, a chicken and egg debate with evidence on both sides. What's clear is that mail service improved dramatically throughout the 1800s, with routes expanding, delivery times shortening and costs decreasing. Transformations that made distance less absolute and connection more possible. Beyond written correspondence, frontier people developed various signalling systems for communication over shorter distances. Smoke signals, borrowed from Native American practice, could convey simple messages across miles of terrain. Arranged signals, a white cloth hung from a particular tree, rocks arranged in a specific pattern, could communicate agreed-upon meanings between neighbours. The crack of gunfire could indicate emergency, success in hunting, or simply announce your presence to avoid being mistaken for game. The isolation of frontier communication shaped relationships in ways that modern instant connectivity minds might not appreciate. You couldn't simply call your family when you missed them, or send a quick message when you wanted advice. Decisions had to be made without consultation, emergencies handled without reinforcement. This enforced independence was both liberating and lonely, and frontier people developed emotional resilience around communication's limitations that let them maintain connections despite the gaps. News travelled slowly and unevenly. You might learn of a president's election months after it occurred, hear about wars only when returning soldiers passed through your region, remain ignorant of developments in your own state for weeks after they happened. This informational isolation wasn't entirely negative. It freed you from the constant churn of distant events that characterises modern news consumption. But it also meant that important information sometimes arrived too late to be useful, and visiting became particularly important for maintaining family connections across distance. Trips to see relatives, though expensive and time-consuming, provided concentrated relationship building that letters couldn't match. A week spent with your brother's family could sustain the connection for years of subsequent silence. Frontier families organised their travel, when they could travel, to maximise these relationship maintenance opportunities, understanding that physical presence created bonds that correspondence alone couldn't forge. The development of telegraph technology later in the century would begin transforming frontier communication, but for now, in your 1847 cabin, the old methods persist. You'll write your letter tonight by firelight, using precious paper and homemade ink, condensing months of experience into a few densely packed pages. Tomorrow or next week, you'll carry it to the Henderson place, where it can join other letters waiting for someone travelling toward a post office. In a month, maybe two, your brother might receive it. In another month or two, if he replies promptly and circumstances favour delivery, you might hear back. This timeline seems impossibly slow to modern sensibilities, but it was simply reality for frontier families. Connection persisted across these gaps, relationships maintained through sporadic contact, and the certain knowledge that loved ones continued to exist even when you couldn't communicate with them. The silence between letters wasn't emptiness, it was faith. Trust that the people you cared about were living their lives just as you were living yours, and that the next communication would bridge the gap whenever it arrived. The rabbits need to be processed, and as you prepare them for cooking, you're thinking about the economic realities of frontier life. Specifically, how you're going to pay for the salt you'll need to preserve any meat you don't eat tonight. Money is scarce out here, almost theoretical, and the economy you actually participate in runs on trade, barter, and accumulated social obligations more than on cash. Understanding this informal economy was essential for frontier survival, and its rules, though unwritten, were as binding as any contract. Your cabin contains a few coins, carefully hoarded, perhaps enough to buy salt and a few other essentials if you travel to a settlement where merchants accept currency. But most of your transactions don't involve money at all. Last month you helped your neighbour repair his fence. He owes you labour in return to be collected whenever you need it. The bullets you're using came from a trade with a travelling peddler, your spare hatchet for his ammunition, and a handful of fishhooks. The flour in your cabinet arrived through a complex chain of exchanges that you couldn't fully reconstruct if you tried. Pelts were the closest thing to universal currency in many frontier regions. A good beaver pelt had known value. A stack of rabbit skins could purchase specific goods. Trappers and hunters accumulated pelts, not primarily for personal use, but as trade goods, exchangeable for the manufactured items, metal tools, cloth, salt, ammunition, that couldn't be produced locally. The pelt economy had its own rates of exchange, fluctuating with fashion, supply, and the negotiation skills of individual traders. Here's a quirky detail about frontier economics. Reputation functioned as a form of capital that influenced every transaction. A person known for fair dealing could obtain credit, attract trading partners, and access community resources during emergencies. A person known for cheating or failing to reciprocate was effectively frozen out of the informal economy, a devastating outcome in environments where self-sufficiency was impossible and trade was essential. Historians still argue whether frontier economies were fundamentally pro-capitalist, existing outside the cash-based market systems developing in eastern cities, or whether they represented regional variations within a fundamentally unified national economy. The answer probably depends on specific locations and time periods, but what's clear is that frontier people lived with multiple economic systems simultaneously, moving between cash, barter, and social reciprocity as circumstances demanded. The labour exchange system was particularly important for tasks requiring more workers than a single family could provide. Barn raisings, the famous example, brought entire communities together for construction projects too large for individuals. But smaller exchanges happened constantly. I help you harvest, you help me butcher, I lend you my oxen, you give me butter. These exchanges weren't precisely measured. They operated on rough equivalents and the understanding that over time things would even out. Social obligations sometimes felt like a form of wealth. A family with many connections, many people who owed them favours, had security that cash couldn't provide. If your cabin burned, the community would help you rebuild. If illness struck, neighbours would bring food. If death came, survivors would be absorbed into other households until they could establish themselves independently. This safety net required investment. You had to help others to earn the right to be helped. But the returns were genuine and sometimes life-saving. Trading posts and general stores served as economic hubs, places where various forms of value could be converted. You might bring pelts, receive credit, and use that credit to purchase manufactured goods over multiple visits. The storekeeper functioned as banker, currency exchanger, and market maker, determining what your goods were worth and what prices you'd pay for others. These were powerful positions, and wise frontier people maintained relationships with multiple trading options to avoid dependence on any single merchant. The transition toward cash economy accelerated throughout the 1800s as transportation improved and markets became more accessible. But even as money became more common, the older exchange systems persisted in areas where cash remained scarce. Many frontier families lived simultaneously in multiple economic worlds, using cash when they had it and could use it, reverting to barter and social exchange when circumstances favoured those approaches. Your immediate economic situation requires some planning. The salt you need can be purchased at the trading post, 20 miles distant, but getting there costs time and energy that you're not sure you can spare right now. Alternatively, you might trade labour or goods with someone who has salt to spare, but you'd need to identify such a person and negotiate terms, or you might simply do without salt for now, adjusting your preservation strategies to match your available resources. These calculations are constant in frontier life. The endless weighing of options, the assessment of relative values, the decisions about where to invest limited time, energy and goods. It's exhausting in its way, but it also develops economic skills that most modern people never need to acquire. You understand value, understand exchange, understand the give and take of sustainable trading relationships in ways that people who simply buy what they need cannot fully appreciate. The rabbits are cleaned now, one set aside for immediate cooking, the other hung for tomorrow. The economic calculus continues in the background of your mind as you prepare dinner, weighing options and planning transactions that will sustain you through the weeks ahead. Your thoughts turn to a journey you'll need to make soon, not just to the trading post but beyond it, to a settlement on the other side of terrain that includes a river crossing and several miles of difficult ground. Travel in frontier America was never simple, and the techniques for moving safely across dangerous landscape represented serious survival knowledge that could mean the difference between arriving at your destination and becoming another cautionary tale. Rivers presented perhaps the most consistent challenge. Bridges existed near settlements, but were rare in wilderness areas, meaning most crossings required fording, walking, riding, or driving directly through the water. The first rule of fording was information. You needed to know where crossings were safe, and this knowledge came from experience, local advice, or dangerous experimentation. Depth mattered, obviously, but so did current strength, bottom composition, and bank conditions on both sides. The ideal ford was shallow enough to wade, with a firm bottom of gravel or rock, gentle enough current to maintain footing, and banks gradual enough to enter and exit without difficulty. Such crossings existed but required finding. Approaches included throwing sticks to assess current, using poles to probe depth and bottom condition, and observing where animal trails crossed. Creatures who used the river regularly had usually identified the best spots. When depth exceeded what you could wade, options became more limited and more dangerous. Swimming rivers with cargo required waterproofing your goods, wrapping them in oiled cloth, sealing them in barrels, or simply accepting that some items would get wet. Horses could swim with riders if trained for it, but the experience was frightening and the risk of drowning genuine. Improvised rafts, constructed from available logs and branches, provided platforms for cargo transport but were unstable and difficult to control. Here's a quirky detail about river crossing. The temperature of the water mattered enormously beyond simple comfort. Cold water sapped strength rapidly, making even short crossings dangerous. Hypothermia could begin developing within minutes in cold water, and exhausted swimmers lost the strength to complete crossings that would have been manageable when fresh. Smart travellers crossed in the warmest part of the day, stripped wet clothing immediately after emerging, and had dry clothes or fire ready on the far bank. Historians still argue whether documented drowning deaths from river crossings accurately reflected their frequency, or whether many such deaths went unrecorded, lost with the victims in waters that concealed their fate. The fragmentary nature of frontier records makes definitive statements impossible, but anecdotal evidence suggests drowning was common enough that everyone knew someone who had died attempting crossings. Mountain passes presented different challenges. The grades might be too steep for wagons, requiring unpacking, carrying goods separately, and sometimes disassembling and reassembling vehicles. Snow in high passes could block travel for months, stranding travellers who had misjudged seasonal timing. The thin air at elevation exhausted travellers and animals, slowing progress and increasing the time spent in dangerous terrain. Quicksand and similarly treacherous ground existed in various forms depending on region. The dramatic sinking depicted in movies was rare, but getting stuck in soft ground was genuinely dangerous. It exhausted attempts to escape, immobilized travellers for extended periods, and sometimes required rescue by others who might not arrive in time. Reading ground conditions, identifying suspicious areas, and testing footing before committing weight were survival skills for travellers in unfamiliar terrain. Weather multiplied the danger of all travel challenges. A river easily fordable under normal conditions became impassable after heavy rain. Mountain passes safe in summer were deadly in early or late season storms. Simple trails became muddy pits that trapped wagons and exhausted draft animals. The best frontier travellers built weather flexibility into their plans, accepting delays rather than pushing through conditions that invited disaster. Your planned journey will take several days in good conditions, longer if problems arise. You'll carry supplies for the trip plus extra in case of delays. You'll time your departure to arrive at the river crossing during what's usually a low water period. You'll check with neighbours about recent trail conditions before leaving. All of this planning increases your chances of success, though nothing guarantees it. Travel in frontier America always carried risk, and accepting that risk was part of participating in a dispersed society, where goods, information, and people needed to move across difficult distances. The preparation itself takes time, checking your equipment, assembling supplies, determining what you can carry versus what must stay behind. Travel in this era wasn't just movement, it was a project requiring careful thought and significant resources. The modern experience of simply getting in a car and driving bears almost no relationship to what frontier travel demanded. Those rabbits in your snares didn't catch themselves, and the techniques you used to secure them represent hunting and trapping knowledge that supported frontier survival throughout the era. Firearms got the glory in folklore, but patient trapping often provided more reliable protein than the uncertainties of pursuit hunting, and the methods developed for both activities reflected sophisticated understanding of animal behaviour and human capability. Your snare line uses simple technology, wire loops positioned along rabbit trails, designed to tighten around the animal's neck when it passes through. But effective use required understanding where rabbits travelled, how they behaved when encountering obstacles, and how to position snares for maximum capture probability. The loops needed to be the right size. Too small, and rabbits passed around them. Too large, and they passed through without triggering the mechanism. Location was everything. Rabbits followed established trails between feeding and resting areas, and these trails showed visible wear in vegetation and soil. Snares placed across active trails caught animals. Snares placed at random caught nothing. Reading sign, the tracks, droppings and vegetation patterns that indicated animal presence and movement, was essential trapping knowledge that took months or years to develop properly. Various trap types existed for different animals. Deadfalls used weighted logs or rocks to crush animals attracted by bait. Pit traps used concealed holes that animals fell into and couldn't escape. Box traps captured animals alive for later killing or possible domestication. Steel traps, becoming more available as manufacturing improved, used spring-loaded jaws to grab and hold animals by the leg. Each trap type had appropriate uses, and experienced trappers maintained arsenals of techniques suited to different prey in different conditions. Here's a quirky detail about frontier trapping. Ethical concerns about animal suffering existed in this period, though they were framed differently than modern sensibilities would frame them. Many trappers deliberately used killing traps, like snares and deadfalls, rather than holding traps, like leg hold devices, because quick death seemed more appropriate than prolonged suffering. This wasn't universal. The fur trade often demanded pelts in specific conditions that holding traps better produced. But it was common enough to represent a genuine ethical tradition. Historians still argue whether Native American trapping techniques were wholesale adopted by European American trappers, or whether the two traditions developed largely independently. The evidence suggests significant exchange. Certain trap designs appear identical across cultural boundaries, suggesting direct knowledge transfer, while other techniques remained culture-specific. The truth is probably complex, with adoption, adaptation, and independent innovation all occurring simultaneously. Hunting with firearms required different skills than trapping. The single-shot muzzleloaders common throughout much of the 1800s demanded accuracy. You got one shot, and if you missed, the game typically fled while you spent a minute or more reloading. This placed premiums on approach, positioning, and marksmanship that made hunting as much an intellectual as a physical pursuit. The approach to game required understanding animal senses and behaviours. Deer relied heavily on smell, so approaching from downwind was essential. Their hearing was acute, meaning silent movement through terrain that nature had designed to crunch and crack. Their vision detected movement more than shape, so stillness often provided concealment that hiding couldn't. Successful hunters learned to think like their prey, anticipating behaviour and positioning themselves accordingly. Stalking techniques varied by terrain and target. In open country, hunters used available cover, rocks, vegetation, terrain features, to approach undetected. In forests, they moved slowly, sometimes taking hours to cover a few hundred yards, placing each footstep carefully and freezing at any indication of awareness. The patience required exceeded what most modern people could sustain. Successful frontier hunters developed almost meditative states of focused attention that allowed them to maintain stealth for extended periods. Shot placement mattered because wounded animals could travel considerable distances before dying, and tracking them through wilderness was time-consuming and uncertain. Ethical hunters aimed for quick kills, heart and lung shots that dropped animals within yards, rather than shots that might wound and lose game. This wasn't just ethics. It was practical wisdom, since every lost wounded animal represented wasted ammunition and effort. The butchering and transport of killed game demanded further skills. Large animals like deer needed to be field-dressed immediately, internal organs removed to prevent spoilage, then either processed on site or transported whole to your cabin for further work. The weight of a deer carcass exceeded 100 pounds. Moving it any distance required strength, technique, and sometimes the help of others. Everything was used. Meat for food, hide for leather, sinew for cordage, bones for tools and broth. Your hunting and trapping for this winter has been adequate. Not abundant, but sufficient. The rabbits represent reliable small game that you can secure regularly through snares. An occasional deer provides larger quantities of meat that require more preservation effort but sustain you longer. The balance between hunting effort and dietary return shapes your time allocation, as it did for everyone trying to feed themselves from wild resources. The snare designs you use, the tracking techniques you've developed, the very landscape patterns you've learned to read, much of this knowledge originated not with European settlers, but with the indigenous peoples who had lived with this land for thousands of years. Native American survival wisdom represents accumulated knowledge so sophisticated that modern scientists are still documenting techniques that were routine practice for traditional cultures, and the transfer of this knowledge to settlers shaped frontier survival in ways that historical narratives often under-acknowledge. The most basic adoption was agricultural. The Three Sisters planting method of corn, beans and squash together, which European farmers initially dismissed as disorganised, but which actually represents remarkably efficient intercropping. The corn provides structure for bean vines to climb. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil that feeds the corn and squash. The squash leaves shade the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining moisture. Together, the three crops produce more calories per acre than monoculture approaches, with less labour and without depleting soil fertility. Indigenous food preservation techniques were similarly adopted, though often without acknowledgement. Pemmican, that concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat and berries, provided caloric density and shelf stability that no European preservation method could match. Native drying and smoking techniques often surpassed what settlers had known in their homelands. The use of particular plants for food, cattails, acorns, wild rice, required processing knowledge that indigenous peoples shared with settlers who were wise enough to learn. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates the depth of indigenous ecological knowledge. Native burning practices deliberately shaped landscapes in ways that increased productivity and reduced wildfire risk. Regular controlled burns cleared underbrush, encouraged beneficial plant growth, and created conditions that attracted game. European settlers who prohibited or disrupted these practices found themselves dealing with landscapes that grew progressively less productive and more dangerous, a consequence of ignorance that took generations to understand. Historians still argue whether knowledge transfer between indigenous peoples and settlers was primarily cooperative, sharing freely offered and gratefully received, or coerced and extracted through colonial relationships that indigenous peoples had little choice but to accept. Both occurred, in varying proportions depending on time, place, and the specific individuals involved. What's undeniable is that settler survival often depended on indigenous knowledge, regardless of how that knowledge was obtained. Medical knowledge transferred significantly, particularly plant-based remedies. Indigenous pharmacopoeia included hundreds of plants used for specific therapeutic purposes, many of which proved genuinely effective when subjected to later scientific investigation. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for immune support, various plants for wound treatment. These remedies entered frontier medical practice through contact with native peoples who'd been using them for generations. Navigation and tracking skills were taught and learned, sometimes formally through employed guides, sometimes informally through observation and imitation. Indigenous peoples understood animal behaviour, terrain features, and seasonal patterns in ways that newcomers couldn't quickly replicate. The frontier trapper or hunter who learned from native teachers gained advantages that could take years to develop independently. The material culture transfers were equally significant. Moccasins, superior to European footwear for forest travel, were widely adopted. Snowshoes made winter travel possible in regions where European-style walking was impractical. Canoe designs enabled water travel far more efficiently than European boat traditions allowed. The material technologies that made frontier survival possible were often indigenous innovations, adopted by settlers who recognized their superiority. Not all knowledge transfer was voluntary or positive. Indigenous peoples were often coerced, displaced, or killed, and their lands were taken through processes that make any romantic narrative of friendly exchange deeply problematic. The survival knowledge that benefited settlers came from peoples who were simultaneously being dispossessed, and acknowledging the debt doesn't resolve the injustice. This historical complexity deserves recognition even in an account focused primarily on survival techniques rather than political history. Your own knowledge base reflects this complex inheritance. The snare designs you use combine European wire technology with positioning techniques learned from native trappers. The plants you forage include species whose uses were taught by indigenous peoples to early settlers who passed the knowledge through generations. The very landscape you navigate has been shaped by indigenous practices even as the peoples who practiced them were being pushed from their lands. Survival knowledge doesn't respect cultural boundaries. It flows toward whoever needs it, and whoever can receive it. The frontier you inhabit was created through violence and displacement, but the techniques that sustain you there draw from every tradition that contributed understanding of how to live with this land. Acknowledging this doesn't excuse the violence or resolve the injustices. It simply recognises that survival itself is always a collaborative inheritance, dependent on what others knew before us. The conversation about frontier medicine from earlier barely scratched the surface, because disease didn't strike individually. It swept through communities in waves that killed percentages of populations and shaped settlement patterns for generations. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, malaria, yellow fever. These epidemic diseases were part of frontier life in ways that our vaccinated, antibiotic-protected modern minds can barely comprehend, and the quarantine and treatment methods communities developed saved some lives while failing spectacularly to save others. Cholera arrived in America in 1832 and recurred in devastating outbreaks throughout the middle decades of the century. The disease killed quickly, sometimes within hours of first symptoms, through massive dehydration from uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting. One day you were healthy, the next day you might be dead. The randomness and speed of cholera death created terror beyond what the actual death tolls, though horrific, might suggest. The disease spread through contaminated water, a fact that wasn't scientifically established until John Snow's famous 1854 investigation in London. Before that understanding, people attributed cholera to miasmas, bad air rising from swamps, sewers, and other unpleasant-smelling places. This theory wasn't entirely wrong in practical terms. Places that smelled bad were often places where water contamination was likely, so avoiding miasmatic locations sometimes accidentally protected against the actual transmission route. Quarantine represented the most logical response given contemporary understanding. When cholera struck a community, healthy residents fled if they could, and isolated themselves if they couldn't. Affected households were marked and avoided. Trade and travel ceased. These measures actually helped when they prevented infected water from spreading, though the theory behind them, stopping bad air, was incorrect. Here's a quirky detail about epidemic response. Some communities burned tar barrels or fired cannons during outbreaks, believing that smoke and concussion would purify the air and drive away disease. This seems absurd now, but it reflected genuine attempts to respond to catastrophe using available understanding. The rituals provided psychological comfort even when they offered no actual protection. Historians still argue whether frontier communities were more or less vulnerable to epidemic disease than urban populations. Cities had denser populations and worse sanitation, creating ideal conditions for disease spread. But cities also had more medical resources, more infrastructure for organised response, and quicker communication about outbreaks elsewhere. Frontier settlements might be protected by isolation. Diseases couldn't reach them if no infected person travelled there, but once disease arrived, resources for response were scarce. Smallpox represented a different terror, though one with an actual countermeasure. Vaccination, developed in the late 1700s, provided genuine protection against a disease that had killed hundreds of millions throughout human history. The technique spread gradually through America, and many frontier families made deliberate efforts to obtain vaccination for their children. But vaccine availability was uneven. Some people distrusted the technique, and outbreaks continued to devastate unprotected populations. Malaria was endemic throughout much of America, particularly in lowland areas with standing water where mosquitoes bred. The fever and ague that newcomers to such regions reliably developed was malaria, and its recurring cycles of chills, fever, and sweats weakened victims for months or years. Quinine, derived from South American tree bark, provided effective treatment, but its expense and limited availability meant that many sufferers simply endure their symptoms and hope to develop resistance. The psychological impact of epidemic disease shaped frontier society profoundly. Every family had lost members, every community had experienced outbreaks. Death was familiar in ways that modern expectations of long life and medical rescue have obscured. This familiarity didn't eliminate grief. People mourned their losses as intensely as people always have. But it did create cultural frameworks for processing loss that our death-averse society lacks. Children died with particular frequency, and the response to child death illustrated the cultural adaptations epidemic reality required. Parents loved their children but maintained emotional reserves, knowing that loss was likely. Naming conventions sometimes reflected this. Children might not receive formal names until they had survived infancy's most dangerous period. Gravestones recorded multiple child deaths from single families, losses so common they became almost expected. Your own survival through childhood epidemics marked you as fortunate, though you probably didn't think of it in those terms. The siblings who died, the neighbours who didn't survive that bad summer, these losses integrated into your understanding of life's terms without the psychological frameworks modern therapy might provide. Disease was part of existence, like weather or animal predators, something to be endured rather than defeated. The fire crackles, you're healthy today, and the cabin is warm against the winter that insulates you from whatever contagions might be moving through the wider world. Spring will bring new disease risks, malaria as mosquitoes emerge, typhoid as wells become contaminated by spring runoff. But for now, isolation provides protection that frontier people often didn't think to appreciate until it was breached. Winter has been the background condition of everything we've discussed, but it deserves focused attention because the cold months tested every survival skill simultaneously, creating compounding challenges that could overwhelm even experienced frontier families. The winter you're currently enduring represents an annual survival gauntlet that your ancestors passed through year after year, accumulating knowledge written in frostbite scars and hunger memories. The preparation for winter began in late summer and intensified through autumn. Every activity during those months served dual purposes: immediate needs plus winter storage. You harvested crops for eating and for preserving. You cut firewood for autumn and for the long cold to come. You hunted and preserved meat, gathered and dried wild foods, made and mended clothing. The quality of this preparation determined winter's difficulty. Excellent preparation meant relative comfort. Poor preparation meant suffering and possible death. The cold itself presented direct physiological challenges. Hypothermia could develop insidiously, particularly if clothing became wet or wind increased heat loss. Frostbite damaged extremities when exposure continued too long. Fingers, toes, ears, nose, any exposed skin at risk. The body burned more calories maintaining temperature in cold weather, increasing food requirements at exactly the season when food was hardest to obtain. Winter demanded more while providing less. Snow complicated everything. Accumulation might bury paths you relied upon, make travel to outbuildings difficult, and collapse structures not built to handle the load. Shoveling was constant work, clearing the area around your cabin, maintaining access to woodpile and privy, and any livestock shelters. Heavy snowfall could trap you inside for days, making the adequacy of your indoor supplies suddenly critical. Here's a quirky detail about frontier winter survival. Body heat was a resource to be shared. Families slept together in cold weather, combining their warmth under shared blankets. Livestock might be brought into living spaces during the worst conditions, their body heat contributing to survival for both species. The intimacy that modern people associate with personal space was simply impractical when warmth was scarce. Historians still argue whether winter death rates were significantly higher than other seasons, or whether the perception of winter's deadliness exceeded reality. Evidence suggests genuine seasonal variation in mortality, with winter and early spring showing elevated death rates from respiratory illness, accidents related to cold conditions, and the cumulative effects of food shortage. Winter was genuinely dangerous, not just legendarily so. The darkness compounded winter's challenges. Short days and long nights limited productive work hours and created psychological pressure that modern humans rarely experience. The technology of lighting, candles, oil lamps, firelight, couldn't adequately replace sunlight, and many activities simply couldn't be performed in dim evening conditions. Winter evenings stretched interminably, and the boredom of enforced inactivity could become its own form of suffering. Food management became critical as winter progressed. You began the season with whatever you'd stored, and that supply dwindled steadily through the months. Careful rationing stretched supplies further. Careless consumption left you short in late winter when hunting was difficult and nothing grew. The late winter period, February through early April, was historically the most dangerous for hunger, when autumn's stores were nearly exhausted and spring's renewal hadn't yet arrived. The diseases of winter had their own patterns. Respiratory illnesses spread readily when people huddled indoors in close proximity. The malnutrition of late winter weakened immune systems, making infections more dangerous. The cold that killed infections vectors also dried airways, making people more susceptible to whatever pathogens did circulate. Winter wellness required both physical warmth and disease avoidance, objectives sometimes in tension. Your fire burns bright, your food supplies are holding, and the winter beyond your walls is doing what winter does, testing every preparation, every skill, every decision made in warmer months. The cabin creaks in the cold, wind finding gaps you thought you'd sealed, but the essential warmth holds. You'll get through this winter as you've gotten through others, and spring will arrive eventually, as it always does, transforming challenge back into opportunity. The rhythms of frontier survival synchronized with these seasonal demands. Winter was for endurance, for making do, for waiting. Spring was for renewal and expansion. Summer was for production and accumulation. Autumn was for preservation and preparation. Each season presented its own challenges and rewards, and successful frontier life meant mastering all of them, while accepting that any might deliver hardships beyond your ability to manage. The labour that sustains your survival is often framed as masculine, hunting, building, splitting wood, but the parallel domestic production system maintained primarily by women was equally essential and arguably more diverse in its demands. Female pioneers possessed specialised knowledge that kept households functioning, and dismissing this work as less important than outdoor, male labour reveals more about modern assumptions than about frontier reality. Textile production, as we touched on earlier, consumed enormous amounts of female labour, but the scope of domestic production extended far beyond clothing. Soap-making transformed kitchen grease and wood ash lye into the cleaning agent that prevented disease accumulation. Candle-making, dipping wicks repeatedly in melted tallow or beeswax, produced the light that extended productive hours into evening. These weren't trivial crafts, they were industrial processes scaled to household production, requiring knowledge, skill, and considerable time. Food preparation and preservation occupied the largest share of domestic labour. Cooking from raw ingredients over open flame demanded skills that modern convenience has largely eliminated. You couldn't just heat prepared food, you had to transform raw materials into edible meals, often improvising based on available ingredients and fuel supplies. The mental load of planning meals from limited and variable supplies, while balancing nutrition, taste and preservation needs, represented cognitive work that recipes and refrigeration have made unnecessary. Here's a quirky detail about frontier domestic labour. Childcare was woven through all other work rather than separated into dedicated time. Women worked with children literally attached to them, babies in slings, toddlers in arm's reach, because no alternative childcare existed. This meant that all domestic production happened while simultaneously supervising small humans who were doing their best to injure themselves. The cognitive load of this dual attention work exceeded what either task would have demanded alone. Historians still argue whether frontier gender divisions represented liberation from rigid old world roles or replication of European patriarchy in new settings. Evidence supports both interpretations. Women on the frontier often performed work that would have been considered masculine in settled communities: outdoor labour, property management during husbands' absences, business negotiations. But they also remained primarily responsible for domestic production, and their legal status remained subordinate to husbands in most jurisdictions. Midwifery represented perhaps the most significant female medical specialty. Trained, formally or informally, in the processes of pregnancy and birth, midwives attended the majority of frontier deliveries. Their knowledge saved lives, proper positioning for difficult births, recognition of dangerous complications, postpartum care that prevented infection. The best midwives accumulated experience across hundreds of births, developing expertise that formal medical training often couldn't match. Healing more broadly was often women's domain within families. The knowledge of which herbs helped which conditions, how to prepare medicines, when to worry about symptoms, this passed through female lines, mothers teaching daughters, neighbours sharing information. Professional doctors were rare, expensive, and often harmful. Domestic medical knowledge provided most of the healthcare most people received. The emotional labour of frontier life also fell disproportionately to women. Managing family morale through isolation, loss, and hardship required interpersonal skills that were assumed rather than recognised. Comforting children frightened by storms or predator sounds, supporting husbands through failure and discouragement, maintaining hope when circumstances suggested despair. This work was invisible, but essential, creating psychological conditions that made physical survival possible. Your cabin, if you're imagining yourself as a woman in this scenario, is filled with evidence of this invisible labour. The preserved food, the sewn clothing, the cleaned surfaces, the children who have survived infancy. all reflect work that frontier narratives often skip past in their rush toward dramatic hunting scenes and cabin-raising moments. The quotidian competence that kept households running was no less survival critical for being ordinary. The knowledge systems women maintained deserve recognition as genuine intellectual traditions. Understanding how to keep a household functioning through variable conditions, adjusting to what was available, improvising when supplies failed, maintaining standards that prevented disease and dysfunction, required exactly the kind of adaptive intelligence that survival demanded. Domestic labour wasn't less skilled than other frontier work. It was differently skilled, and dismissing it as simple fails to recognise what it actually required. Your survival doesn't depend on you alone. It never has and never could. The frontier might seem like a landscape of rugged individualism, but underneath that mythology lies a dense network of mutual obligations that made settlement possible. The unwritten rules of community aid bound neighbours together in relationships that functioned as survival insurance, and violating those rules could leave you dangerously exposed. The barn raising was the most visible manifestation of cooperative labour, but similar patterns applied throughout frontier production. Neighbours helped neighbours at harvest time when speed mattered and the weather window was narrow. Butchering parties assembled when large animals needed processing quickly before spoilage set in. Logging bees gathered when someone needed timber cleared. The pattern was consistent. Tasks too large for individual families or requiring speed beyond individual capacity became community projects. Reciprocity governed these exchanges, though not in a formal accounting sense. You didn't keep precise records of hours given and owed. You trusted that the community would remember who helped and who didn't, and that your needs would be met when they arose. This soft accounting was remarkably effective precisely because it was soft. The absence of formal tracking created social pressure to contribute generously, since being seen as a shirker was worse than being slightly exploited by others. Here's a quirky detail about frontier mutual aid. The food served at community work events was often more elaborate than everyday meals, representing hosts' genuine effort to thank helpers. A barn raising meant not just labour contribution, but also a significant feast. Preserved meats, special baked goods, perhaps precious imported treats. The quality of this food reflected on the hosting family and served as indirect payment for neighbours' time. Historians still argue whether frontier communities were genuinely egalitarian in their mutual aid practices, or whether assistance flowed preferentially to some families while others were neglected. Evidence suggests variation. Some communities maintained broadly inclusive aid networks, while others developed informal hierarchies that directed support toward favoured families. The democratic ideal of frontier cooperation wasn't always the reality. Emergency response illustrated mutual aid at its most critical. When fire, illness, or death struck a family, neighbours responded immediately and comprehensively. A cabin fire meant community effort to rebuild shelter before weather closed in. Serious illness meant neighbours bringing food, tending children, handling work that the sick person couldn't manage. Death meant not just burial assistance but ongoing support for survivors, widow and children absorbed into helping networks until they could manage independently. The obligations of mutual aid extended to travellers and strangers under most circumstances. A person arriving at your door near nightfall was entitled to shelter and food, regardless of whether you knew them. This hospitality rule wasn't mere politeness. In a landscape where the next shelter might be miles away and weather could turn deadly, refusing travellers was essentially sentencing them to potential death. Most frontier people honoured this obligation, understanding that they too might someday need its protection. The enforcement mechanisms for mutual aid norms were social rather than legal. No court compelled you to help your neighbours. Community opinion and the prospect of future reciprocity did. A family that refused to participate in community labour, that neglected helping neighbours in crisis, that violated hospitality norms, found themselves socially isolated in ways that could threaten survival. Being cut off from the community network meant facing challenges alone that others faced together. Your relationships with neighbours, distant as they might be geographically, represent genuine survival resources. When you help the Henderson family with their harvest, you're depositing in an account you can't see but can definitely draw upon. When you respond to the emergency at the Miller place, you're reinforcing a pattern that will protect you when your own emergency arrives. The accounting is imprecise, but the system works, creating resilience that individual families couldn't achieve alone. The frontier demanded self-reliance, certainly, but it also demanded community reliance, the willingness to depend on others and to be depended upon. Both forms of reliance were survival skills, and developing the social connections that made community reliance possible required investment of time, effort, and sometimes resources. The mythology of the lone frontier hero misses this essential point. Almost no one survived alone, and those who did often paid psychological costs that made their physical survival feel hollow. The trails that crossed the American continent represented perhaps the most ambitious survival challenges the frontier offered, not the daily endurance of cabin life, but the concentrated ordeal of travelling thousands of miles through territory that had killed thousands before you. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the California Trail, these routes demanded preparation so extensive and adaptation so constant that making it through represented genuine achievement. Preparation for overland travel began months before departure. Wagons needed to be selected or constructed, robust enough for the journey, but light enough for draft animals to pull. Supplies needed to be calculated with care. Enough food for months of travel, enough spare parts for inevitable repairs, enough trade goods for potential negotiations, but not so much that the wagon became impossibly heavy. Families sold homes and businesses to finance the journey, burning bridges that made failure even more catastrophic. The timing of departure mattered enormously. Leave too early, and the spring grasses that fed your animals hadn't grown sufficiently. Leave too late, and you risked being caught in mountain passes by autumn snows. The window was narrow, a few weeks in late spring when conditions favoured travel, and tens of thousands of emigrants crowded onto trails during this period, creating traffic jams in the wilderness and competition for limited grazing and water. Here's a quirky detail about overland travel. The trails were littered with discarded possessions, abandoned when their weight became unbearable. Families who had paid dearly for goods they thought essential found themselves throwing them away to lighten loads that exhausted animals couldn't pull. Pianos, furniture, books, tools. The trail routes became outdoor museums of failure, testament to misjudged preparation, meeting unforgiving reality. Historians still argue whether emigrant deaths on overland trails resulted primarily from disease, accident, violence, or starvation. The evidence suggests disease, particularly cholera, killed far more emigrants than any other cause, followed by accidents involving river crossings, wagon mishaps, and firearm mishandling. Violence from Native Americans, though feared, caused relatively few deaths compared to disease and accident. Starvation was rare for prepared emigrants, but devastating for those who miscalculated. The daily routine of trail travel established rhythms that emigrants remembered for the rest of their lives. Wake before dawn, prepare breakfast over campfires, hitch animals to wagons, move out by sunrise, travel until midday, rest during the hottest hours, continue until evening, make camp, tend animals, cook dinner, sleep. Repeat for months across terrain that varied from relatively easy plains to brutal mountain crossings. The monotony was broken only by challenges: river crossings, broken equipment, sick animals, human illness. Water and grass for livestock determined travel possibilities more than human needs did. Your oxen or mules needed to eat and drink daily, and the trails passed through territory where these resources varied dramatically. Dry stretches required careful timing and preparation. Overused areas near popular campsites had been grazed bare, requiring early departures to claim better spots or longer detours to find adequate resources. The animals that pulled your wagon were your transportation. Their welfare determined whether you continued or were stranded. Group dynamics on overland journeys range from cooperative to disastrous. Some wagon trains functioned as remarkably effective communities, sharing resources, caring for each other's sick, organising efficiently for common challenges. Others dissolved into conflict, with families abandoning groups or groups abandoning struggling families. The stress of the journey intensified existing tensions and revealed character in ways that normal life never tested. The arrival at destination didn't end the survival challenge, it transformed it. Emigrants reaching Oregon or California still needed to establish themselves, find land, build shelter, begin producing food. Many arrived late in the season with limited resources, facing winter without adequate preparation. The death toll during these establishment periods sometimes exceeded trail deaths, a grim conclusion to journeys that had already demanded so much. The frontier you've been imagining wasn't singular. It was a collection of radically different environments, each demanding specialised survival approaches. The techniques that worked in eastern forests failed on the Great Plains. What sustained desert travellers would be useless in bayou country. Adapting to regional conditions was as important as general survival competence, and pioneers who moved between regions had to relearn much of what they thought they knew. The Great Plains presented a landscape so different from eastern forests that early travellers sometimes suffered psychological disturbance from the absence of trees. The horizons stretched unbroken in every direction, providing no landmarks, no shade, no building materials, no fuel. Settlers who tried to apply eastern techniques, log cabin construction, wood fire cooking, quickly discovered that their knowledge was irrelevant. The sod house and the buffalo chip fire represented regional adaptations that made plains living possible. Water scarcity on the plains created challenges unknown in the eastern forests. Streams were fewer and farther between, water tables deeper and harder to reach, rainfall unreliable, and often insufficient for eastern-style agriculture. Dry farming techniques developed over decades of trial and error eventually allowed crop production in low rainfall areas, but early settlers often failed repeatedly before these methods were understood. The desert southwest demanded even more radical adaptation. Survival in areas receiving less than 10 inches of annual rainfall required techniques developed by indigenous peoples over millennia. Irrigation systems, drought-adapted crops, architecture designed for extreme heat rather than extreme cold. Anglo-settlers who arrived expecting to recreate eastern patterns often suffered or died before learning the necessity of regional approaches. Here's a quirky detail about regional adaptation. The same clothing that saved lives in northern winters could kill in southwestern summers. The heavy wool layers that prevented hypothermia created dangerous overheating in desert conditions. Frontier travellers moving between climate zones had to completely reconfigure their wardrobes, a non-obvious requirement that some learned only through painful experience with heat exhaustion. Historians still argue whether regional variation in frontier experience was more significant than the common elements, or whether overarching patterns of adaptation transcended regional differences. Both perspectives have merit. Certain survival challenges, food preservation, shelter construction, disease management, appeared everywhere, while specific solutions varied dramatically by region. The frontier was unified in its demands, but diverse in the answers those demands required. The humid south presented yet another set of challenges. Heat, humidity, and abundant rainfall created disease environments unknown in cooler, drier regions. Malaria was endemic in lowland areas, and yellow fever epidemics devastated coastal cities. Building practices adapted to heat and humidity, raised floors for airflow, wide porches for shade, construction techniques that resisted rot and mould. Survival in the south meant learning to live with conditions that would have been merely uncomfortable elsewhere. The Pacific Northwest offered abundant resources but challenging climate. Heavy rainfall and dense forests created different conditions than any region earlier emigrants had known. The fishing-based food systems of indigenous peoples reflected adaptation to these specific resources, and settlers who adopted these approaches thrived more readily than those who insisted on practices developed elsewhere. The regional diversity of frontier America meant that no single survival manual could cover all circumstances. Knowledge that was essential in one place was useless or actively harmful in another. The best frontier survivors were those who recognized this diversity and approached new environments with humility, willing to learn rather than assuming their existing knowledge was sufficient. Regional adaptation wasn't just physical adjustment, it was intellectual flexibility, the recognition that survival wisdom was always context-dependent. The night is coming now, the sky through your oiled paper window shifting from blue to violet, to the deep purple that precedes full darkness. The fire you've tended all day burns low but steady, its warmth reaching every corner of your small cabin as you prepare for sleep. These forgotten secrets of survival in 1800s America, the firekeeping, the water purification, the foraging and preserving, the navigation and community bonds, they live in you now, not as abstract knowledge, but as felt understanding of how your ancestors made their way through a world that demanded everything and forgave nothing. The lessons they learned weren't preserved in textbooks. They passed hand to hand, parent to child, neighbour to neighbour, through demonstration and correction, and the occasional disaster that taught what gentler instruction couldn't. Much of this knowledge has vanished, simply forgotten by generations who didn't need to keep their own fires burning or purify their own water, or read the sky for weather signs. But something remains, echoes of competence that our bodies remember even when our minds have moved on. You've spent this day in 1847 doing what frontier people did every day, tending fire, managing water, checking snares, processing food, maintaining shelter, watching weather, navigating terrain, protecting against threats both physical and psychological. None of these tasks was dramatic, all of them were essential. The frontier didn't ask for heroism, it asked for consistency, for showing up day after day with the attention and effort that survival required. And perhaps that's the most important lesson that emerges from this exploration of forgotten survival knowledge. Persistence matters more than perfection. Your ancestors weren't superhuman. They made mistakes, faced setbacks, lost people they loved to diseases they couldn't cure and accidents they couldn't prevent. What they did was continue, getting up each morning, rebuilding what had failed, adapting to what had changed, finding ways forward through circumstances that would have justified despair. The skills themselves retain surprising relevance even in our technology-saturated present. Emergencies still happen. Storms that knock out power, disasters that disrupt supply chains, circumstances that briefly return people to conditions resembling the frontier. Those who understand how to start fires, purify water, preserve food, navigate without technology, read weather signs, maintain psychological resilience, they face such emergencies differently than those who have delegated all survival functions to systems beyond their understanding or control. But beyond practical application, there's something valuable in simply knowing how people lived before convenience became invisible. The light switch, the faucet, the thermostat, the supermarket, each represents accumulated ingenuity that we use without appreciating, solutions to problems so thoroughly solved that we've forgotten they were problems. Imagining life without these solutions doesn't just teach survival skills, it teaches gratitude for the mundane miracles surrounding us constantly. Your fire settles, logs collapsing into the coal bed you'll bank before sleep. The rabbits you caught, cleaned, and cooked have filled your belly with warmth that will last through the cold night. Tomorrow will bring more tasks, more calculations, more of the endless negotiations between human need and natural provision that defined frontier existence. But tonight, you rest, having done what the day required. The snow that threatened this morning begins to fall now, fat flakes drifting past your window and settling on ground that will be white by morning. You watch them descend, each one unique and temporary, each one adding to the accumulation that will insulate the earth until spring returns. The frontier is quieting for the night, creatures finding shelter, winds settling, the world drawing in upon itself in the way that winter teaches. The fire's glow has softened now to something deeper, warmer, the kind of light that doesn't demand attention but simply offers presence. Your eyes have grown heavy through these hours of exploration, these miles of mental travel across landscapes that existed and exist still in the accumulated memory of the people who crossed them. The cabin around you, whether imagined or remembered, feels smaller now, cozier, a shell of warmth against the vast cold night beyond its walls. Let the snare lines rest until morning. Let the weather do what weather does, unconcerned with human plans or human comfort. Let the fire burn down to coals that will wait patiently through the darkness, ready to be coaxed back to life when the sun returns and you return with it, rested and renewed. The frontier demanded wakefulness, but it also honoured rest, understanding that bodies and minds needed repair that only sleep could provide. The snow continues falling, each flake finding its place among countless others, building something larger than any individual contribution. The sound of it, that particular muffled quiet that snowfall creates, wraps around your consciousness like the wool blankets wrapped around your body. The cold retreats, distance grows, and the present moment narrows to nothing but this comfortable darkness, this gentle warmth, this breath, and the breath after it. Tomorrow the work will resume as it always did, as it always does. But tomorrow is tomorrow's concern. Tonight you've done enough. You've tended what needed tending, learned what could be learned, imagined yourself into a time and place that shaped everything that followed. Now that imagining can soften, blur at the edges, dissolve gradually into the kind of formless peace that waits at the edge of sleep. The frontier fades, the cabin grows quiet, your breath deepens and slows, finding the rhythm that your body knows better than your mind does. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between the remembered past and the restful present, you understand that survival was always about this. Finding shelter, finding warmth, finding rest when the world permitted it. Sleep now, sleep well, the morning will come when it comes,